Section 61 of Man and Wife. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynne Thompson. Man and Wife by Wilkie Collins. 16th Scene. Salt Patch. Chapter the 53rd. What had happened in the hours of darkness? This was Anne's first thought when the sunlight poured in at her window and woke her the next morning. She made immediate inquiry of the servant. The girl could only speak for herself. Nothing had occurred to disturb her after she had gone to bed. Her master was still, she believed, in his room. Mrs. Dethridge was at her work in the kitchen. Anne went to the kitchen. Hester Dethridge was at her usual occupation at that time, preparing the breakfast. The slight signs of animation which Anne had noticed in her when they had met appeared no more. The dull look was back again in her stony eyes. The lifeless torpor possessed all her movements. Asked if anything had happened in the night, she slowly shook her stolid head, slowly made the sign with her hand which signified nothing. Leaving the kitchen, Anne saw Julius in the front garden. She went out and joined him. "I believe I have to thank your consideration for me for some hours of rest," he said. "It was 5 in the morning when I woke. I hope you had no reason to regret having left me to sleep. I went into Geoffrey's room and found him stirring. A second dose of the mixture composed him again. The fever has gone. He looks weaker and paler, but in other respects like himself. We will return directly to the question of his health. I have something to say to you, first, about a change which may be coming in your life here." "Has he consented to the separation?" "No. He is as obstinate about it as ever. I have placed the matter before him in every possible light. He still refuses, positively refuses, a provision which would make him an independent man for life." "It is the provision he might have had, Lord Holchester, if he had married Mrs. Glenarm. No, it is impossible, consistently with my duty to my mother, and with what I owe to the position in which my father's death has placed me, that I can offer him such a fortune as Mrs. Glenarm's. Still, it is a handsome income which he is mad enough to refuse. I shall persist in pressing it on him. He must and shall take it." Anne felt no reviving hope roused in her by his last words. She turned to another subject. "You had something to tell me," she said. "You spoke of a change." "True. The landlady here is a very strange person, and she has done a very strange thing. She has given Geoffrey notice to quit these lodgings." "Notice to quit?" Anne repeated, in amazement. "Yes, in a formal letter. She handed it to me open as soon as I was up this morning. It was impossible to get any explanation from her. The poor dumb creature simply wrote on her slate, 'He may have his money back if he likes. He shall go.' Greatly to my surprise, for the woman inspires him with the strongest aversion, Geoffrey refuses to go until his term is up. I have made the peace between them for to-day. Mrs. Dethridge, very reluctantly, consents to give him 24 hours, and there the matter rests at present." "What can her motive be?" said Anne. "It's useless to inquire. Her mind is evidently off its balance. One thing is clear: Geoffrey shall not keep you here much longer. The coming change will remove you from this dismal place, which is one thing gained. And it is quite possible that new scenes and new surroundings may have their influence on Geoffrey for good. His conduct, otherwise quite incomprehensible, may be the result of some latent nervous irritation which medical help might reach. I don't attempt to disguise from myself or from you that your position here is a most deplorable one. But before we despair of the future, let us at least inquire whether there is any explanation of my brother's present behaviour to be found in the present state of my brother's health. I have been considering what the doctor said to me last night. The first thing to do is to get the best medical advice on Geoffrey's case which is to be had. What do you think?" "I daren't tell you what I think, Lord Holchester. I will try. It is a very small return to make for your kindness. I will try to see my position with your eyes, not with mine. The best medical advice that you can obtain is the advice of Mr. Speedwell. It was he who first made the discovery that your brother was in broken health." "The very man for our purpose. I will send him here to day or to morrow. Is there anything else I can do for you? I shall see Sir Patrick as soon as I get to town. Have you any message for him?" Anne hesitated. Looking attentively at her, Julius noticed that she changed colour when he mentioned Sir Patrick's name. "Will you say that I gratefully thank him for the letter which Lady Holchester was so good as to give me last night?" she replied. "And will you entreat him from me not to expose himself on my account to—" She hesitated, and finished the sentence with her eyes on the ground. "To what might happen if he came here and insisted on seeing me." "Does he propose to do that?" She hesitated again. The little nervous contraction of her lips at one side of the mouth became more marked than usual. "He writes that his anxiety is unendurable, and that he is resolved to see me," she answered softly. "He is likely to hold to his resolution, I think," said Julius. "When I saw him yesterday, Sir Patrick spoke of you in terms of admiration." He stopped. The bright tears were glittering on Anne's eyelashes. One of her hands was toying nervously with something hidden, possibly Sir Patrick's letter, in the bosom of her dress. "I thank him with my whole heart," she said, in low, faltering tones. "But it is best that he should not come here." "Would you like to write to him?" "I think I should prefer your giving him my message." Julius understood that the subject was to proceed no further. Sir Patrick's letter had produced some impression on her, which the sensitive nature of the woman seemed to shrink from acknowledging, even to herself. They turned back to enter the cottage. At the door they were met by a surprise. Hester Dethridge, with her bonnet on, dressed at that hour of the morning to go out. "Are you going to market already?" Anne asked. Hester shook her head. "When are you coming back?" Hester wrote on her slate, "Not till the night time." Without another word of explanation, she pulled her veil down over her face and made for the gate. The key had been left in the dining room by Julius, after he had let the doctor out. Hester had it in her hand. She opened the gate and closed the door after her, leaving the key in the lock. At the moment when the door banged, Geoffrey appeared in the passage. "Where's the key?" he asked. "Who's gone out?" His brother answered the question, looked backward and forward suspiciously between Julius and Anne. "What does she go out for at this time?" he said. "Has she left the house to avoid me?" Julius thought this the likely explanation. Geoffrey went down sulkily to the gate to lock it, and returned to them, with the key in his pocket. "I'm obliged to be careful of the gate," he said. "The neighborhood swarms with beggars and tramps. If you want to go out," he added, turning pointedly to Anne, "I'm at your service, as a good husband ought to be." After a hurried breakfast, Julius took his departure. "I don't accept your refusal," he said to his brother, before Anne. "You will see me here again." Geoffrey obstinately repeated the refusal. "If you come here every day of your life," he said, "it will be just the same." The gate closed on Julius. Anne returned again to the solitude of her own chamber. Geoffrey entered the drawing-room, placed the volumes of the Newgate Calendar on the table before him, and resumed the reading which he had been unable to continue on the evening before. Hour after hour he doggedly plodded through one case of murder after another. He had read one good half of the horrid chronicle of crime before his power of fixing his attention began to fail him. Then he lit his pipe, and went out to think over it in the garden. However the atrocities of which he had been reading might differ in other respects, there was one terrible point of resemblance, which he had not anticipated, and in which every one of the cases agreed. Sooner or later, there was the dead body always certain to be found, always bearing its dumb witness, in the traces of poison or in the marks of violence, to the crime committed on it. He walked to and fro slowly, still pondering over the problem which had first found its way into his mind when he had stopped in the front garden and had looked up at Anne's window in the dark. How? That had been the one question before him, from the time when the lawyer had annihilated his hopes of a divorce. It remained the one question still. There was no answer to it in his own brain. There was no answer in it in the book which he had been consulting. Everything was in his favor if he could only find out how. He had got his hated wife upstairs at his mercy, thanks to his refusal of the money which Julius had offered to him. He was living in a place absolutely secluded from public observation on all sides of it, thanks to his resolution to remain at the cottage. even after his landlady had insulted him by sending him a notice to quit. Everything had been prepared, everything had been sacrificed, to the fulfilment of one purpose. And how to attain that purpose was still the same impenetrable mystery to him which it had been from the first. What was the other alternative? To accept the proposal which Julius had made, in other words, to give up his vengeance on Anne, and to turn his back on the splendid future which Mrs. Glenarm's devotion still offered to him. Never. He would go back to the books. He was not at the end of them. The slightest hint in the pages which were still to be read might set his sluggish brain working in the right direction. The way to be rid of her, without exciting the suspicion of any living creature, in the house or out of it, was a way that might be found yet. Could a man, in his position of life, reason in this brutal manner? Could he act in this merciless way? Surely the thought of what he was about to do must have troubled him this time. Pause for a moment, and look back at him in the past. Did he feel any remorse when he was plotting the betrayal of Arnold in the garden at Windygates? The sense which feels remorse had not been put into him. What he is now is the legitimate consequence of what he was then. A far more serious temptation is now urging him to commit a far more serious crime. How is he to resist? Will his skill in rowing, as Sir Patrick once put it, his swiftness in running, his admirable capacity and endurance in other physical exercises, help him to win a purely moral victory over his own selfishness and his own cruelty? No, the moral and mental neglect of himself, which the material tone of public feeling about him has tacitly encouraged, has left him at the mercy of the worst instincts of his nature, of all that is most vile, and of all that is most dangerous in the composition of the natural man. With the mass of his fellows, no harm out of the common has come of this, because no temptation out of the common has passed their way. But with him the case is reversed. A temptation out of the common has passed his way. How does it find him prepared to meet him? It finds him, literally and exactly, what his training has left him. In the presence of any temptation, small or great, a defenceless man. Geoffrey returned to the cottage. The servant stopped him in the passage to ask what time he wished to dine. Instead of answering, he inquired angrily for Mrs. Dethridge. Mrs. Dethridge had not come back. It was now late in the afternoon, and she had been out since the early morning. This had never happened before. Vague suspicions of her, one more monstrous than another, began to rise in Geoffrey's mind. Between the drink and the fever he had been, as Julius had told him, wandering in his mind during a part of the night. Had he let anything out in that condition? Had Hester heard it? And was it, by any chance, at the bottom of her long absence, and her notice to quit? He determined, without letting her see that he suspected her, to clear up that doubt as soon as his landlady returned to the house. The evening came. It was past 9 o'clock before there was a ring at the bell. The servant came to ask for the key. Geoffrey rose to go to the gate himself, and changed his mind before he left the room. Her suspicions might be roused, supposing it to be Hester who was waiting for admission, if he opened the gate to her when the servant was there to do it. He gave the girl the key, and kept out of sight. "Dead tired," the servant said to herself, seeing her mistress by the light of the lamp over the gate. "Dead tired," Geoffrey said to himself, observing Hester suspiciously as she passed him in the passage on her way upstairs to take off her bonnet in her own room. "Dead tired," Anne said to herself, meeting Hester on the upper floor, and receiving from her a letter in Blanche's handwriting, delivered to the mistress of the cottage by the postman, who had met her at her own gate. Having given the letter to Anne, Hester Dethridge withdrew to her bedroom. Geoffrey closed the door of the drawing-room, in which the candles were burning, and went into the dining-room, in which there was no light. Leaving the door ajar, he waited to intercept his landlady on her way back to her supper in the kitchen. Hester wearily secured her door, wearily lit the candles, wearily put the pen and ink on the table. For some minutes after this she was compelled to sit down and rally her strength and fetch her breath. After a little she was able to remove her upper clothing. This done, she took the manuscript inscribed "My Confession" out of the secret pocket of her stays, turned to the last leaf as before, and wrote another entry, under the entry made on the previous night. This morning I gave him notice to quit, and offered him his money back if he wanted it. He refuses to go. He shall go tomorrow, or I will burn the place over his head. All through today I have avoided him by keeping out of the house. No rest to ease my mind, and no sleep to close my eyes. I humbly bear my cross as long as my strength will let me." At those words the pen dropped from her fingers. Her head nodded on her breast. She roused herself with a start. Sleep was the enemy she dreaded. Sleep brought dreams. She unfastened the window shutters and looked out at the night. The peaceful moonlight was shining over the garden. The clear depths of the night sky were soothing and beautiful to look at. What, fading already? Clouds? Darkness? No, nearly asleep once more. She roused herself again with a start. There was the moonlight, and there was the garden as bright under it as ever. Dreams or no dreams, it was useless to fight longer against the weariness that overpowered her. She closed the shutters and went back to the bed, and put her confession in its customary place at night, under her pillow. She looked round the room and shuddered. Every corner of it was filled with the terrible memories of the past night. She might wake from the torture of the dreams to find the terror of the apparition watching at her bedside. Was there no remedy, no blessed safeguard under which she might tranquilly resign herself to sleep? A thought crossed her mind. The good book, the Bible. If she slept with the Bible under her pillow, there was hope in the good book, the hope of sleeping in peace. It was not worth while to put on the gown and the stays which she had taken off. Her shawl would cover her. It was equally needless to take the candle. The lower shutters would not be closed at that hour, and, if they were, she could lay her hand on the Bible, in its place on the parlour bookshelf, in the dark. She removed the confession from under her pillow. Not even for a minute could she prevail on herself to leave it in one room while she was away from it, in another. With the manuscript folded up and hidden in her hand, she slowly descended the stairs again. Her knees trembled under her. She was obliged to hold by the banister, with the hand that was free. Geoffrey observed her from the dining-room on her way down the stairs. He waited to see what she did before he showed himself, and spoke to her. Instead of going on into the kitchen, she stopped short and entered the parlour. Another suspicious circumstance? What did she want in the parlour, without a candle, at that time of night? She went to the bookcase, her dark figure plainly visible in the moonlight that flooded the little room. She staggered and put her hand to her head, giddy to all appearance from extreme fatigue. She recovered herself and took a book from the shelf. She leaned against the wall after she had possessed herself of the book, too weary, as it seemed, to get upstairs again without a little rest. Her armchair was near her. Better rest for a moment or two to be had in that than could be got by leaning against the wall. She sat down heavily in the chair, with the book on her lap. One of her arms hung over the arm of the chair, with her hand closed, apparently holding something. Her head nodded on her breast, recovered itself, and sank gently on the cushion at the back of the chair. Asleep? Fast asleep. In less than a minute the muscles of the closed hand that hung over the arm of the chair slowly relaxed. Something white slipped out of her hand and lay in the moonlight on the floor. Geoffrey took off his heavy shoes and entered the room noiselessly in his stockings. He picked up the white thing on the floor. It proved to be a collection of several sheets of thin paper, neatly folded together and closely covered with writing. Writing? As long as she was awake she had kept it hidden in her hand. Why hide it? Had he let out anything to compromise himself when he was light-headed with the fever the night before? And had she taken it down in writing to produce against him? Possessed by guilty distrust, even that monstrous doubt assumed a look of probability to Geoffrey's mind. He left the parlour as noiselessly as he had entered it, and made for the candlelight in the drawing-room, determined to examine the manuscript in his hand. After carefully smoothing out the folded leaves on the table, he turned to the first page and read these lines. End of chapter 61.
Section 62 of Man and Wife. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anna Simon. Man and Wife by Wilkie Collins. 16th Scene. Chapter the 54th, Part 1. The Manuscript. 1. My confession. To be put into my coffin, and to be buried with me when I die. This is the history of what I did in the time of my married life. Here, known to no other mortal creature, confessed to my Creator alone, is the truth. At the great day of the resurrection, we shall all rise again in our bodies as we have lived. When I am called before the judgment seat, I shall have this in my hand. O just and merciful Judge, Thou knowest what I have suffered. My trust is in Thee. 2. I am the eldest of a large family, born of pious parents. We belong to the congregation of the Primitive Methodists. My sisters were all married before me. I remained for some years the only one at home. At the latter part of the time my mother's health failed, and I managed the house in her place. Our spiritual pastor, good Mr. Bapchild, used often to dine with us on Sundays between the services. He approved of my management of the house, and in particular of my cooking. This was not pleasant to my mother, who felt a jealousy of my being, as it were, set over her in her place. My unhappiness at home began in this way. My mother's temper got worse as her health got worse. My father was much away from us, travelling for his business. I had to bear it all. About this time I began to think it would be well for me if I could marry as my sisters had done, and have good Mr. Bapchild to dinner between the services in a house of my own. In this frame of mind I made acquaintance with a young man who attended service at our chapel. His name was Joel Dethridge. He had a beautiful voice. When we sang hymns he sang off the same book with me. By trade he was a paper-hanger. We had much serious talk together. I walked with him on Sundays. He was a good 10 years younger than I was, and, being only a journeyman, his worldly station was below mine. My mother found out the liking that had grown up between us. She told my father the next time he was at home. Also my married sisters and my brothers. They all joined together to stop things from going further between me and Joel Dethridge. I had a hard time of it. Mr. Bapchild expressed himself as feeling much grieved at the turn things were taking. He introduced me into a sermon, not by name, but I knew who it was meant for. Perhaps I might have given way if they had not done one thing. They made inquiries of my young man's enemies, and brought wicked stories of him to me behind his back. This, after we had sung off the same hymn-book, and walked together, had agreed one with the other on religious subjects, was too much to bear. I was of age to judge for myself. And I married Joel Dethridge. 3. My relations all turned their backs on me. Not one of them was present at my marriage. My brother Reuben, in particular, who led the rest, saying that they had done with me from that time forth. Mr. Bapchild was much moved, shed tears, and said he would pray for me. I was married in London by a pastor who was a stranger, and we settled in London with fair prospects. I had a little fortune of my own, my share of some money left to us girls by our Aunt Hester, whom I was named after. It was £300. Nearly 100 of this I spent in buying furniture to fit up the little house we took to live in. The rest I gave to my husband to put into the bank against the time when he wanted it to set up in business for himself. For 3 months, more or less, we got on nicely, except in one particular. My husband never stirred in the matter of starting in business for himself. He was once or twice cross with me when I said it seemed a pity to be spending the money in the bank, which might be afterward wanted, instead of earning more in business. Good Mr. Bapchild, happening about this time to be in London, stayed over Sunday and came to dine with us between the services. He had tried to make my peace with my relations, but he had not succeeded. At my request he spoke to my husband about the necessity of exerting himself. My husband took it ill. I then saw him seriously out of temper for the first time. Good Mr. Bapchild said no more. He appeared to be alarmed at what had happened, and he took his leave early. Shortly afterward my husband went out. I got tea ready for him, but he never came back. I got supper ready for him, but he never came back. It was past 12 at night before I saw him again. I was very much startled by the state he came home in. He didn't speak like himself or look like himself. He didn't seem to know me, wandered in his mind, and fell all in a lump like on our bed. I ran out and fetched the doctor to him. The doctor pulled him up to the light and looked at him, smelled his breath and dropped him down again on the bed, turned about and stared at me. "What's the matter, sir?" I says. "Do you mean to tell me you don't know?" says the doctor. "No, sir," says I. "Why, what sort of a woman are you," says he, "not to know a drunken man when you see him?" With that he went away, and left me standing by the bedside, all in a tremble from head to foot. This was how I first found out that I was the wife of a drunken man. 4. I've omitted to say anything about my husband's family. While we were keeping company together he told me he was an orphan, with an uncle and aunt in Canada, and an only brother settled in Scotland. Before we were married he gave me a letter from this brother. It was to say that he was sorry he was not able to come to England and be present at my marriage, and to wish me joy and the rest of it. Good Mr. Bapchild, to whom in my distress I wrote word privately of what had happened, wrote back in return, telling me to wait a little and see whether my husband did it again. I had not long to wait. He was in liquor again the next day, and the next. Hearing this, Mr. Bapchild instructed me to send him the letter from my husband's brother. He reminded me of some of the stories about my husband which I had refused to believe in the time before I was married, and he said it might be well to make inquiries. The end of the inquiries was this. The brother at that very time was placed privately, by his own request, under a doctor's care to get broken of habits of drinking. The craving for strong liquor, the doctor wrote, was in the family. They would be sober sometimes for months together, drinking nothing stronger than tea. Then the fit would seize them, and they would drink, 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 for days together, like the mad and miserable wretches that they were. This was the husband I was married to, and I had offended all my relations and estranged them from me for his sake. Here was surely a sad prospect for a woman after only a few months of wedded life. In a year's time the money in the bank was gone, and my husband was out of employment. He always got work, being a first-rate hand when he was sober, and always lost it again when the drinking fit seized him. I was loath to leave our nice little house, and part with my pretty furniture, and I proposed to him to let me try for employment, by the day, as cook, and so keep things going while he was looking out again for work. He was sober and penitent at the time, and he agreed to what I proposed. And, more than that, he took the total abstinence pledge, and promised to turn over a new leaf. Matters, as I thought, began to look fairly again. We had nobody but our two selves to think of. I had borne no child, and had no prospect of bearing one. Unlike most women, I thought this a mercy instead of a misfortune. In my situation, as I soon grew to know, my becoming a mother would only have proved to be an aggravation of my hard lot. The sort of employment I wanted was not to be got in a day. Good Mr. Bapchild gave me a character, and our landlord, a worthy man, belonging, I am sorry to say, to the Popish Church, spoke for me to the steward of a club. Still, it took time to persuade people that I was the thorough-good cook I claimed to be. Nigh on a fortnight had passed before I got the chance I had been looking out for. I went home in good spirits, for me, to report what had happened, and found the brokers in the house, carrying off the furniture which I had bought with my own money for sale by auction. I asked them how they dared touch it without my leave. They answered, civilly enough I must own, that they were acting under my husband's orders, and they went on removing it before my own eyes, to the cart outside. I ran upstairs, and found my husband on the landing. He was in liquor again. It is useless to say what passed between us. I shall only mention that this was the first occasion on which he lifted his fist and struck me. 5. Having a spirit of my own, I was resolved not to endure it. I ran out to the police court hard by. My money had not only bought the furniture, it had kept the house going as well, paying the taxes which the Queen and the Parliament asked for among other things. I now went to the magistrate to see what the Queen and the Parliament, in return for the taxes, would do for me. "Is your furniture settled on yourself?" he says, when I told him what had happened. I didn't understand what he meant. He turned to some person who was sitting on the bench with him. "This is a hard case," he says. "Poor people in this condition of life don't even know what a marriage settlement means, and if they did, how many of them could afford to pay the lawyer's charges?" Upon that he turned to me. "Yours is a common case," he said. "In the present state of the law I can do nothing for you." It was impossible to believe that. Common or not, I put my case to him over again. "I've bought the furniture with my own money, sir," I says. "It's mine, honestly come by, with bill and receipt to prove it. They're taking it away from me by force, to sell it against my will. Don't tell me that's the law. This is a Christian country. It can't be." "My good creature," says he, "you are a married woman. The law doesn't allow a married woman to call anything her own, unless she has previously, with a lawyer's help, made a bargain to that effect with her husband before marrying him. You have made no bargain. Your husband has a right to sell your furniture if he likes. I am sorry for you. I can't hinder him." I was obstinate about it. "Please to answer me this, sir," I says. "I've been told by wiser heads than mine that we all pay our taxes to keep the Queen and the Parliament going, and that the Queen and the Parliament make laws to protect us in return. I have paid my taxes. Why, if you please, is there no law to protect me in return?" "I can't enter into that," says he. "I must take the law as I find it, and so must you. I see a mark there on the side of your face. Has your husband been beating you? If he has, summon him here. I can punish him for that." "How can you punish him, sir?" says I. "I can fine him," says he, "or I can send him to prison." "As to the fine," says I, "he can pay that out of the money he gets by selling my furniture. As to the prison, while he's in it, what's to become of me, with my money spent by him and my possessions gone? And when he's out of it, what's to become of me again, with a husband whom I have been the means of punishing, and who comes home to his wife knowing it? It's bad enough as it is, sir," says I. "There's more that's bruised in me than what shows in my face. I wish you good morning." 6. When I got back the furniture was gone, and my husband was gone. There was nobody but the landlord in the empty house. He said all that could be said, kindly enough toward me, so far as I was concerned. When he was gone I locked my trunk, and got away in a cab after dark, and found a lodging to lay my head in. If ever there was a lonely, broken-hearted creature in the world, I was that creature that night. There was but one chance of earning my bread, to go to the employment offered me under a man cook at a club, and there was but one hope, the hope that I had lost sight of my husband forever. I went to my work and prospered in it, and earned my first quarter's wages. But it's not good for a woman to be situated as I was, friendless and alone, with her things that she took a pride in sold away from her, and with nothing to look forward to in her life to come. I was regular in my attendance at chapel, but I think my heart began to get hardened, and my mind to be overcast in secret with its own thoughts about this time. There was a change coming. 2 or 3 days after I had earned the wages just mentioned, my husband found me out. The furniture money was all spent. He made a disturbance at the club. I was only able to quiet him by giving him all the money I could spare from my own necessities. The scandal was brought before the committee. They said, if the circumstance occurred again, they should be obliged to part with me. In a fortnight, the circumstance occurred again. It's useless to dwell on it. They all said they were sorry for me. I lost the place. My husband went back with me to my lodgings. The next morning I caught him taking my purse, with the few shillings I had in it, out of my trunk, which he had broken open. We quarrelled, and he struck me again, this time knocking me down. I went once more to the police court and told my story, to another magistrate this time. My only petition was to have my husband kept away from me. I don't want to be a burden on others, I says. I don't want to do anything but what's right. I don't even complain of having been very cruelly used. All I ask is to be let to earn an honest living. Will the law protect me in the effort to do that? The answer in substance was that the law might protect me, provided I had money to spend in asking some higher court to grant me a separation. After allowing my husband to rob me openly of the only property I possessed, namely my furniture, The law turned round on me when I called upon it in my distress, and held out its hand to be paid. I had just 3 and 6pence left in the world, and the prospect, if I earned more, of my husband coming, with permission of the law, and taking it away from me. There was only one chance, namely, to get time to turn round in, and to escape him again. I got a month's freedom from him by charging him with knocking me down. The magistrate, happening to be young and new to this business, sent him to prison instead of fining him. This gave me time to get a character from the club, as well as a special testimonial from good Mr. Bapchild. With the help of these I obtained a place in a private family, a place in the country this time. I found myself now in a haven of peace. I was among worthy, kind-hearted people, who felt for my distresses, and treated me most indulgently. Indeed, through all my troubles, I must say I have found one thing hold good. In my experience, I have observed that people are oftener quick than not to feel a human compassion for others in distress. Also, that they mostly see plain enough what's hard and cruel and unfair on them in the governing of the country which they help to keep going. But once ask them to get on from sitting down and grumbling about it, to rising up and setting it right, and what do you find them? As helpless as a flock of sheep. That's what you find them. More than 6 months passed, and I saved a little money again. One night, just as we were going to bed, there was a loud ring at the bell. The footman answered the door, and I heard my husband's voice in the hall. He had traced me, with the help of a man he knew in the police, and he had come to claim his rights. I offered him all the little money I had to let me be. My good master spoke to him. It was all useless. He was obstinate and savage. If, instead of my running off from him, it had been all the other way and he had run off from me, something might have been done, as I understood, to protect me. But he stuck to his wife. As long as I could make a farthing, he stuck to his wife. Being married to him, I had no right to have left him. I was bound to go with my husband. There was no escape for me. I bade them good-bye, and I have never forgotten their kindness to me from that day to this. My husband took me back to London. As long as the money lasted, the drinking went on. When it was gone, I was beaten again. Where was the remedy? There was no remedy but to try and escape him once more. Why didn't I have him locked up? What was the good of having him locked up? In a few weeks he would be out of prison, sober and penitent, and promising amendment, and then when the fit took him, there he would be, the same furious savage that he'd been often and often before. My heart got hard under the hopelessness of it, and dark thoughts beset me, mostly at night. About this time I began to say to myself, "There's no deliverance from this but in death, his death or mine." Once or twice I went down to the bridges after dark and looked over at the river. No, I wasn't the sort of woman who ends her own wretchedness in that way. Your blood must be in a fever and your head in a flame, at least I fancy so. You must be hurried into it like, to go and make away with yourself. My troubles never took that effect on me. I always turned cold under them instead of hot. Bad for me, I dare say. But what you are, you are. Can the Ethiopian change his skin, or the leopard his spots? I got away from him once more, and found good employment once more. It don't matter how, and it don't matter where. My story is always the same thing, over and over again. Best get to the end. There was one change, however, this time. My employment was not in a private family. I was also allowed to teach cookery to young women in my leisure hours. What with this, and what with a longer time passing on the present occasion before my husband found me out, I was as comfortably off as in my position I could hope to be. When my work was done, I went away at night to sleep in a lodging of my own. It was only a bedroom, and I furnished it myself, partly for the sake of economy, the rent being not half as much as for a furnished room, and partly for the sake of cleanliness. Through all my troubles I always liked things neat about me, neat and shapely and good. Well, it's needless to say how it ended. He found me out again, this time by a chance meeting with me in the street. He was in rags and half-starved, but that didn't matter now. All he had to do was to put his hand into my pocket and take what he wanted. There is no limit in England to what a bad husband may do, as long as he sticks to his wife. On the present occasion he was cunning enough to see that he would be the loser if he disturbed me in my employment. For a while things went on as smoothly as they could. I made a pretence that the work was harder than usual, and I got leave, loathing the sight of him, I honestly own, to sleep at the place where I was employed. This was not for long. The fit took him again in due course, and he came and made a disturbance. As before, this was not to be borne by decent people. As before, they were sorry to part with me. As before, I lost my place. Another woman would have gone mad under it. I fancy it just missed by a hair's breadth maddening me. When I looked at him that night, deep in his drunken sleep, I thought of Jael and Sisera. See the book of Judges, chapter 4, verses 17 to 21. It says she took a nail of the tent, and took a hammer in her hand, and went softly unto him, and smote the nail into his temples, and fastened it into the ground, for he was fast asleep and weary. So he died. She did this deed to deliver her nation from Sisera. If there had been a hammer and a nail in the room that night, I think I should have been Jael, with this difference, that I should have done it to deliver myself. With the morning this passed off, for the time. I went and spoke to a lawyer. Most people in my place would have had enough of the law already, but I was one of the sort who drain the cup to the dregs. What I said to him was in substance this: I come to ask your advice about a madman. Mad people, as I understand it, are people who have lost control over their own minds. Sometimes this leads them to entertaining delusions, and sometimes it leads them to committing actions hurtful to others or to themselves. My husband has lost all control over his own craving for strong drink. He requires to be kept from liquor, as other madmen require to be kept from attempting their own lives, or the lives of those about them. It's a frenzy beyond his own control with him, just as it's a frenzy beyond their own control with them. There are asylums for mad people all over the country, at the public disposal, on certain conditions. If I fulfil those conditions, will the law deliver me from the misery of being married to a madman, whose madness is drink? No, says the lawyer, the law of England declines to consider an incurable drunkard as a fit object for restraint. The law of England leaves the husbands and wives of such people in a perfectly helpless situation, to deal with their own misery as they best can. I made my acknowledgments to the gentleman and left him. The last chance was this chance, and this had failed me. 7. The thought that had once found its way into my mind already now found its way back again, and never altogether left me from that time forth. No deliverance for me but in death, his death or mine. I had it before me night and day, in chapel and out of chapel just the same. I read the story of Jael and Sisera so often that the Bible got to open of itself at that place. The laws of my country, which ought to have protected me as an honest woman, left me helpless. In place of the laws, I had no friend near to open my heart to. I was shut up in myself, and I was married to that man. Consider me as a human creature, and say, was this not trying my humanity very hardly? I wrote to good Mr. Bapchild, not going into particulars, only telling him I was beset by temptation, and begging him to come and help me. He was confined to his bed by illness. He could only write me a letter of good advice. To profit by good advice, people must have a glimpse of happiness to look forward to as a reward for exerting themselves. Religion itself is obliged to hold out a reward, and to say to us poor mortals, "Be good, and you shall go to heaven." I had no glimpse of happiness. I was thankful, in a dull sort of way, to good Mr. Bapchild, and there it ended. The time had been when a word from my old pastor would have put me in the right way again. I began to feel scared by myself. If the next ill usage I received from Joel Dethridge found me an unchanged woman, it was borne in strongly on my mind that I should be as likely as not to get my deliverance from him by my own hand. Goaded to it by the fear of this, I humbled myself before my relations for the first time. I wrote to beg their pardon, to own that they had proved to be right in their opinion of my husband, and to entreat them to be friends with me again, so far as to let me visit them from time to time. My notion was that it might soften my heart if I could see the old place, and talk the old talk, and look again at the well-remembered faces. I am almost ashamed to own it, but if I had had anything to give, I would have parted with it all to be allowed to go back into mother's kitchen and cook the Sunday dinner for them once more. But this was not to be. Not long before my letter was received, mother had died. They laid it all at my door. She had been ailing for years past, and the doctors had said it was hopeless from the first, but they laid it all at my door. One of my sisters wrote to say that much, in as few words as could possibly suffice for saying it. My father never answered my letter at all. 8. Magistrates and lawyers, relations and friends, endurance of injuries, patience, hope, and honest work. I had tried all these, and tried them vainly. Look round me where I might, the prospect was closed on all sides. At this time my husband had got a little work to do. He came home out of temper one night, and I gave him a warning. "Don't try me too far, Joel, for your own sake," was all I said. It was one of his sober days, and, for the first time, a word from me seemed to have an effect on him. He looked hard at me for a minute or so, and then he went and sat down in a corner and held his peace. This was on a Tuesday in the week. On the Saturday he got paid, and the drinking fit took him again. On Friday in the next week I happened to come back late, having had a good stroke of work to do that day, in the way of cooking a public dinner for a tavern-keeper who knew me. I found my husband gone, and the bedroom stripped of the furniture which I had put into it. For the second time he had robbed me of my own property, and had turned it into money to be spent in drink. I didn't say a word. I stood and looked round the empty room. What was going on in me I hardly knew myself at the time, and can't describe now. All I remember is that, after a little, I turned about to leave the house. I knew the places where my husband was likely to be found, and the devil possessed me to go and find him. The landlady came out into the passage and tried to stop me. She was a bigger and a stronger woman than I was, but I shook her off like a child. Thinking over it now, I believe she was in no condition to put out her strength. The sight of me frightened her. I found him. I said what a woman beside herself with fury would be likely to say. It's needless to tell how it ended. He knocked me down. After that there is a spot of darkness-like in my memory. The next thing I can call to mind is coming back to my senses after some days. 3 of my teeth were knocked out, but that was not the worst of it. My head had struck against something in falling, and some part of me, a nerve I think they said, was injured in such a way as to affect my speech. I don't mean that I was downright dumb. I only mean that, all of a sudden, it had become a labour to me to speak. A long word was as serious an obstacle as if I was a child again. They took me to the hospital. When the medical gentlemen heard what it was, the medical gentlemen came crowding round me. I appeared to lay hold of their interest, just as a story-book lays hold of the interest of other people. The upshot of it was, that I might end in being dumb, or I might get my speech again. The chances were about equal. Only 2 things were needful. One of them was that I should live on good nourishing diet. The other was, that I should keep my mind easy. About the diet it was not possible to decide. My getting good nourishing food and drink depended on my getting money to buy the same. As to my mind, there was no difficulty about that. If my husband came back to me, my mind was made up to kill him. Horrid. I am well aware this is horrid. Nobody else in my place would have ended as wickedly as that. All the other women in the world, tried as I was, would have risen superior to the trial. End of section 62. Section 63 of Man and Wife. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anna Simon. Man and Wife by Wilkie Collins. 16th Scene, Chapter the 54th, Part 2. 9. I have said that people, excepting my husband and my relations, were almost always good to me. The landlord of the house which we had taken when we were married heard of my sad case. He gave me one of his empty houses to look after, and a little weekly allowance for doing it. Some of the furniture in the upper rooms, not being wanted by the last tenant, was left to be taken at a valuation if the next tenant needed it. 2 of the servants' bedrooms, in the attics, one next to the other, had all that was wanted in them. So I had a roof to cover me, and a choice of beds to lie in, and money to get me food. All well again, but all too late. If that house could speak, what tales that house would have to tell of me! I had been told by the doctors to exercise my speech. Being all alone, with nobody to speak to except when the landlord dropped in, or when the servant next door said, "Nice day, ain't it?" or "Don't you feel lonely?" or such like, I bought the newspaper and read it out loud to myself to exercise my speech in that way. One day I came upon a bit about the wives of drunken husbands. It was a report of something said on that subject by a London coroner who had held inquests on dead husbands in the lower ranks of life, and who had his reasons for suspecting the wives. Examination of the body, he said, didn't prove it, and witnesses didn't prove it, but he thought it nevertheless quite possible, in some cases, that, when the woman could bear it no longer, she sometimes took a damp towel and waited till the husband, drugged with his own liquor, was sunk in his sleep, and then put the towel over his nose and mouth, and ended it that way, without anybody being the wiser. I laid down the newspaper and fell into thinking. My mind was, by this time, in a prophetic way. I said to myself, I haven't happened on this for nothing. This means that I shall see my husband again. It was then just after my dinner time, 2:00. That same night, at the moment when I had put out my candle and laid me down in bed, I heard a knock at the street door. Before I had lit my candle, I says to myself, "Here he is." I huddled on a few things and struck a light and went downstairs. I called out through the door, "Who's there?" and his voice answered, "Let me in." I sat down on a chair in the passage and shook all over like a person struck with palsy. Not from the fear of him, but from my mind being in the prophetic way. I knew I was going to be driven to it at last. Try as I might to keep from doing it, my mind told me I was to do it now. I sat shaking on the chair in the passage, I on one side of the door and he on the other. He knocked again, and again, and again. I knew it was useless to try, and yet I resolved to try. I determined not to let him in till I was forced to it. I determined to let him alarm the neighborhood, and to see if the neighborhood would step between us. I went upstairs and waited at the open staircase window over the door. The policeman came up, and the neighbors came out. They were all for giving him into custody. The policeman laid hands on him. He had but one word to say. He had only to point up to me at the window and to tell them I was his wife. The neighbors went indoors again. The policeman dropped hold of his arm. It was I who was in the wrong, and not he. I was bound to let my husband in. I went downstairs again and let him in. Nothing passed between us that night. I threw open the door of the bedroom next to mine and went and locked myself into my own room. He was dead beat with roaming the streets, without a penny in his pocket all day long. The bed to lie on was all he wanted for that night. The next morning I tried again, tried to turn back on the way that I was doomed to go, knowing beforehand that it would be of no use. I offered him 3 parts of my poor weekly earnings to be paid to him regularly at the landlord's office, if he would only keep away from me and from the house. He laughed in my face. As my husband, he could take all my earnings if he chose. And as for leaving the house offered him free quarters to live in as long as I was employed to look after it. The landlord couldn't part man and wife. I said no more. Later in the day the landlord came. He said if we could make it out to live together peaceably, he had neither the right nor the wish to interfere. If we made any disturbances, then he should be obliged to provide himself with some other woman to look after the house. I had nowhere else to go, and no other employment to undertake. If, in spite of that, I had put on my bonnet and walked out, my husband would have walked out after me. And all decent people would have patted him on the back and said, "Quite right, good man, quite right." So there he was by his own act, and with the approval of others, in the same house with me. I made no remark to him or to the landlord. Nothing roused me now. I knew what was coming. I waited for the end. There was some change visible in me to others, as I suppose, though not noticeable by myself, which first surprised my husband and then daunted him. When the next night came, I heard him lock the door softly in his own room. It didn't matter to me. When the time was ripe, 10,000 locks wouldn't lock out what was to come. The next day, bringing my weekly payment, brought me a step nearer on the way to the end. Getting the money, he could get the drink. This time he began cunningly. In other words, he began his drinking by slow degrees. The landlord, bent, honest man, on trying to keep the peace between us, had given him some odd jobs to do, in the way of small repairs here and there about the house. "You owe this," he says, "to my desire to do a good turn to your poor wife. I am helping you for her sake. Show yourself worthy to be helped if you can." He said, as usual, that he was going to turn over a new leaf. Too late. The time had gone by. He was doomed and I was doomed. It didn't matter what he said now. It didn't matter when he locked his door again the last thing at night. The next day was Sunday. Nothing happened. I went to chapel, mere habit. It did me no good. He got on a little with the drinking, but still cunningly, by slow degrees. I knew by experience that this meant a long fit, and a bad one, to come. Monday there were the odd jobs about the house to be begun. He was by this time just sober enough to do his work, and just tipsy enough to take a spiteful pleasure in persecuting his wife. He went out and got the things he wanted, and came back and called for me. A skilled workman like he was, he said, wanted a journeyman under him. There were things which it was beneath a skilled workman to do for himself. He was not going to call in a man or a boy and then have to pay them. He was going to get it done for nothing, and he meant to make a journeyman of me. Half tipsy and half sober, he went on talking like that, and laying out his things, all quite right, as he wanted them. When they were ready, he straightened himself up, and he gave me his orders what I was to do. I obeyed him to the best of my ability. Whatever he said and whatever he did, I knew he was going as straight as man could go to his own death by my hands. The rats and mice were all over the house, and the place generally was out of repair. He ought to have begun on the kitchen floor, but, having sentence pronounced against him, he began in the empty parlours on the ground floor. These parlours were separated by what is called a lath and plaster wall. The rats had damaged it. At one part they had gnawed through and spoiled the paper, at another part they had not got so far. The landlord's orders were to spare the paper, because he had some by him, to match it. My husband began at a place where the paper was whole. Under his directions I mixed up, I won't say what. With the help of it he got the paper loose from the wall without injuring it in any way, in a long hanging strip. Under it was the plaster and the laths, gnawed away in places by the rats. Though strictly a paper-hanger by trade, he could be plasterer too when he liked. I saw how he cut away the rotten laths and ripped off the plaster, and, under his directions again, I mixed up the new plaster he wanted, and handed him the new laths, and saw how he set them. I won't say a word about how this was done, either. I have a reason for keeping silence here, which is, to my mind, a very dreadful one. In everything that my husband made me do that day, he was showing me, blindfold, the way to kill him, so that no living soul, in the police or out of it, could suspect me of the deed. We finished the job on the wall just before dark. I went to my cup of tea, and he went to his bottle of gin. I left him, drinking hard, to put our 2 bedrooms tidy for the night. The place that his bed happened to be set in, which I had never remarked particularly before, seemed, in a manner of speaking, to force itself on my notice now. The head of the bedstead was set against the wall which divided his room from mine. From looking at the bedstead, I got to looking at the wall next, then to wondering what it was made of, then to rapping against it with my knuckles. The sound told me there was nothing but lath and plaster under the paper. It was the same as the wall we had been at work on downstairs. We had cleared our way so far through this last, in certain places where the repairs were most needed, that we had to be careful not to burst through the paper in the room on the other side. I found myself calling to mind the caution my husband had given me while we were at this part of the work, word for word as he had spoken it. "Take care you don't find your hands in the next room." That was what he had said down in the parlour. Up in his bedroom I kept on repeating it in my own mind, with my eyes all the while on the key which he had moved to the inner side of the door to lock himself in, till the knowledge of what it meant burst on me like a flash of light. I looked at the wall, at the bedhead, at my own 2 hands, and I shivered as if it was winter time. Hours must have passed like minutes while I was upstairs that night. I lost all count of time. When my husband came up from his drinking, he found me in his room. 10. I leave the rest untold and pass on purposely to the next morning. No mortal eyes but mine will ever see these lines. Still, there are things a woman can't write of even to herself. I shall only say this. I suffered the last and worst of many indignities at my husband's hands, at the very time when I first saw, set plainly before me, the way to take his life. He went out toward noon next day to go his rounds among the public houses, my mind being then strung up to deliver myself from him for good and all when he came back at night. The things we had used on the previous day were left in the parlour. I was all by myself in the house, free to put in practice the lesson he had taught me. I proved myself an apt scholar. Before the lamps were lit in the street, I had my own way prepared, in my bedroom and in his, for laying my own hands on him, after he had locked himself up for the night. I don't remember feeling either fear or doubt through all those hours. I sat down to my bit of supper with no better and no worse an appetite than usual. The only change in me that I can call to mind was that I felt a singular longing to have somebody with me to keep me company. Having no friend to ask in, I went to the street door and stood looking at the people passing this way and that. A stray dog sniffing about came up to me. Generally I dislike dogs and beasts of all kinds. I called this one in and gave him his supper. He had been taught, I suppose, to sit up on his hind legs and beg for food. At any rate, that was his way of asking me for more. I laughed. It seems impossible when I look back at it now, but for all that it's true. I laughed till the tears ran down my cheeks at the little beast on his haunches, with his ears pricked up and his head on one side and his mouth watering for the victuals. I wonder whether I was in my right senses. I don't know. When the dog had got all he could get, he whined to be let out to roam the streets again. As I opened the door to let the creature go his ways, I saw my husband crossing the road to come in. "Keep out," I says to him. "To-night of all nights, keep out." He was too drunk to heed me. He passed by and blundered his way upstairs. I followed and listened. I heard him open his door and bang it to, and lock it. I waited a bit and went up another stair or two. I heard him drop down onto his bed. In a minute more he was fast asleep and snoring. It had all happened as it was wanted to happen. In 2 minutes, without doing one single thing to bring suspicion on myself, I could have smothered him. I went into my own room. I took up the towel that I had laid ready. I was within an inch of it, when there came a rush of something up into my head. I can't say what it was. I can only say the horrors laid hold of me and hunted me then and there out of the house. I put on my bonnet and slipped the key of the street door into my pocket. It was only 9:30, or maybe 9:45. If I had any one clear notion in my head, it was the notion of running away, and never allowing myself to set eyes on the house or the husband more. I went up the street and came back. I went down the street and came back. I tried it a third time, and went round and round and round. and came back. It was not to be done. The house held me chained to it like a dog to his kennel. I couldn't keep away from it. For the life of me, I couldn't keep away from it. A company of gay young men and women passed me just as I was going to let myself in again. They were in a great hurry. "Step out," says one of the men. "The theatre's close by, and we shall be just in time for the farce." I turned about and followed them. Having been piously brought up, I had never been inside a theatre in my life. It struck me that I might get taken, as it were, out of myself, if I saw something that was quite strange to me, and heard something which would put new thoughts into my mind. They went into the pit, and I went in after them. The thing they called the farce had begun. Men and women came onto the stage, turn and turn about, and talked and went off again. Before long all the people about me in the pit were laughing and clapping their hands. The noise they made angered me. I don't know how to describe the state I was in. My eyes wouldn't serve me, and my ears wouldn't serve me, to see and to hear what the rest of them were seeing and hearing. There must have been something, I fancy, in my mind that got itself between me and what was going on upon the stage. The play looked fair enough on the surface, but there was danger and death at the bottom of it. The players were talking and laughing to deceive the people, with murder in their minds all the time. And nobody knew it but me, and my tongue was tied when I tried to tell the others. I got up and ran out. The moment I was in the street, my steps turned back of themselves on the way to the house. I called a cab, and told the man to drive, as far as a shilling would take me, the opposite way. He put me down, I don't know where. Across the street I saw an inscription in letters of flame over an open door. The man said it was a dancing place. Dancing was as new to me as play-going. I had 1 more shilling left, and I paid to go in and see what a sight of the dancing would do for me. The light from the ceiling poured down in this place as if it was all on fire. The crashing of the music was dreadful. The whirling round and round of men and women in each other's arms was quite maddening to see. I don't know what happened to me here. The great blaze of light from the ceiling turned blood red on a sudden. The man standing in front of the musicians, waving a stick, took the likeness of Satan, as seen in the picture in our family Bible at home. The whirling men and women went round and round, with white faces like the faces of the dead, and bodies robed in winding sheets. I screamed out with the terror of it, and some person took me by the arm and took me outside the door. The darkness did me good. It was comforting and delicious, like a cool hand laid on a hot head. I went walking on through it, without knowing where, composing my mind with the belief that I had lost my way, and that I should find myself miles distant from home when morning dawned. After some time I got too weary to go on, and I sat me down to rest on a doorstep. I dozed a bit and woke up. When I got on my feet to go on again, I happened to turn my head toward the door of the house. The number on it was the same number as on ours. I looked again, and behold, it was our steps I had been resting on. The door was our door. All my doubts and all my struggles dropped out of my mind when I made that discovery. There was no mistaking what this perpetual coming back to the house meant. Resist it as I might, it was to be. I opened the street door and went upstairs, and heard him sleeping his heavy sleep, exactly as I'd heard him when I went out. I sat down on my bed and took off my bonnet, quite quiet in myself, because I knew it was to be. I damped the towel and put it ready, and took a turn in the room. It was just the dawn of day. The sparrows were chirping among the trees in the square hard by. I drew up my blind. The faint light spoke to me as if in words, "Do it now, before I get brighter and show too much." I listened. The friendly silence had a word for me too. "Do it now, and trust the secret to me." I waited till the church clock chimed before striking the hour. At the first stroke, without touching the lock of his door, without setting foot in his room, I had the towel over his face. Before the last stroke he had ceased struggling. when the hum of the bell through the morning silence was still and dead, he was still and dead with it. 11. The rest of this history is counted in my mind by 4 days: Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. After that it all fades off like, and the new years come with a strange look, being the years of a new life. What about the old life first? What did I feel in the horrid quiet of the morning when I had done it? I don't know what I felt. I can't remember it, or I can't tell it. I don't know which. I can write the history of the 4 days, and that's all. Wednesday. I gave the alarm toward noon. Hours before, I had put things straight and fit to be seen. I had only to call for help and to leave the people to do as they pleased. The neighbors came in, and then the police. They knocked uselessly at his door. Then they broke it open and found him dead in his bed. Not the ghost of a suspicion of me entered the mind of anyone. There was no fear of human justice finding me out. My one unutterable dread was dread of an avenging Providence. I had a short sleep that night, and a dream in which I did the deed over again. For a time my mind was busy with thoughts of confessing to the police, and of giving myself up. If I had not belonged to a respectable family, I should have done it. From generation to generation there had been no stain on our good name. It would be death to my father, and disgrace to all my family, if I owned what I had done, and suffered for it on the public scaffold. I prayed to be guided, and I had a revelation toward morning of what to do. I was commanded in a vision to open the Bible, and vow on it to set my guilty self apart among my innocent fellow creatures from that day forth, to live among them a separate and silent life, to dedicate the use of my speech to the language of prayer only, offered up in the solitude of my own chamber when no human ear could hear me. Alone, in the morning, I saw the vision, and vowed the vow. No human ear has heard me from that time. No human ear will hear me to the day of my death. Thursday. The people came to speak to me as usual. They found me dumb. What had happened to me in the past, when my head had been hurt, and my speech affected by it, gave a likelier look to my dumbness than it might have borne in the case of another person. They took me back again to the hospital. The doctors were divided in opinion. Some said the shock of what had taken place in the house, coming on the back of the other shock, might, for all they knew, have done the mischief. And others said, "She got her speech again after the accident. There has been no new injury since that time. The woman is shamming dumb, for some purpose of her own." I let them dispute it as they liked. All human talk was nothing now to me. I had set myself apart among my fellow creatures. I had begun my separate and silent life. Through all this time the sense of a coming punishment hanging over me never left my mind. I had nothing to dread from human justice. The judgment of an avenging Providence, there was what I was waiting for. Friday. They held the inquest. He had been known for years past as an inveterate drunkard. He had been seen overnight going home in liquor. He had been found locked up in his room, with the key inside the door, and the latch of the window bolted also. No fireplace was in this garret. Nothing was disturbed or altered. Nobody, by human possibility, could have got in. The doctor reported that he had died of congestion of the lungs, and the jury gave their verdict accordingly. 12. Saturday. Marked forever in my calendar as the memorable day on which the judgment descended on me. Toward 3 o'clock in the afternoon, in the broad sunlight under the cloudless sky, with hundreds of innocent human creatures all around me, I, Hester Dethridge, saw for the first time the appearance which is appointed to haunt me for the rest of my life. I had had a terrible night. My mind felt much as it had felt on the evening when I had gone to the play. I went out to see what the air and the sunshine and the cool green of trees and grass would do for me. The nearest place in which I could find what I wanted was the Regent's Park. I went into one of the quiet walks in the middle of the park, where the horses and carriages are not allowed to go, and where old people can sun themselves and children play without danger. I sat me down to rest on a bench. Among the children near me was a beautiful little boy playing with a brand new toy, a horse and wagon. While I was watching him busily plucking up the blades of grass and loading his wagon with them, I felt for the first time what I have often and often felt since. A creeping chill come slowly over my flesh, and then a suspicion of something hidden near me, which would steal out and show itself if I looked that way. There was a big tree hard by. I looked toward the tree and waited to see the something hidden appear from behind it. The thing stole out, dark and shadowy in the pleasant sunlight. At first I saw only the dim figure of a woman. After a little it began to get plainer, brightening from within outward, brightening, 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 till it set before me the vision of my own self, repeated as if I was standing before a glass, the double of myself, looking at me with my own eyes. I saw it move over the grass. I saw it stop behind the beautiful little boy. I saw it stand and listen as I had stood and listened at the dawn of morning for the chiming of the bell before the clock struck the hour. When it heard the stroke, it pointed down to the boy with my own hand, and it said to me with my own voice, "Kill him." A time passed. I don't know whether it was a minute or an hour. The heavens and the earth disappeared from before me. I saw nothing but the double of myself with the pointing hand. I felt nothing but the longing to kill the boy. Then, as it seemed, the heavens and the earth rushed back upon me. I saw the people near staring in surprise at me, and wondering if I was in my right mind. I got by main force to my feet. I looked by main force away from the beautiful boy. I escaped by main force from the sight of the thing back into the streets. I can only describe the overpowering strength of the temptation that tried me in one way. It was like tearing the life out of me to tear myself from killing the boy. And what it was on this occasion it has been ever since. No remedy against it but in that torturing effort, and no quenching the after-agony but by solitude and prayer. The sense of a coming punishment had hung over me, and the punishment had come. I had waited for the judgment of an avenging providence, and the judgment was pronounced. With pious David I could now say, "Thy fierce wrath goeth over me, thy terrors have cut me off." Arrived at that point in the narrative, Geoffrey looked up from the manuscript for the first time. Some sound outside the room had disturbed him. Was it a sound in the passage? He listened. There was an interval of silence. He looked back again at the confession, turning over the last leaves to count how much was left of it before it came to an end. After relating the circumstances under which the writer had returned to domestic service, the narrative was resumed no more. Its few remaining pages were occupied by a fragmentary journal. The brief entries referred to the various occasions on which Hester Dethridge had again and again seen the terrible apparition of herself, and had again and again resisted the homicidal frenzy roused in her by the hideous creation of her own distempered brain. In the effort which that resistance cost her lay the secret of her obstinate determination to insist on being freed from her work at certain times, and to make it a condition with any mistress who employed her that she should be privileged to sleep in a room of her own at night. Having counted the pages thus filled, Geoffrey turned back to the place at which he had left off, to read the manuscript through to the end. As his eyes rested on the first line, the noise in the passage, intermitted for a moment only, disturbed him again. This time there was no doubt of what the sound implied. He heard her hurried footsteps, he heard her dreadful cry. Hester Dethridge had woke in her chair in the parlour, and had discovered that the confession was no longer in her own hands. He put the manuscript into the breast pocket of his coat. On this occasion his reading had been of some use to him. Needless to go on further with it. Needless to return to the Newgate Calendar. The problem was solved. As he rose to his feet, his heavy face brightened slowly with a terrible smile. While the woman's confession was in his pocket, the woman herself was in his power. "If she wants it back," he said, "she must get it on my terms." With that resolution he opened the door and met Hester Dethridge face to face in the passage. End of section 63.
Section 64 of Man and Wife. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynne Thompson. Man and Wife by Wilkie Collins. 16th Scene. Salt Patch. Chapter the 55th, Part 1. The Signs of the End. The servant, appearing the next morning in Anne's room with the breakfast tray, closed the door with an air of mystery, and announced that strange things were going on in the house. "Did you hear nothing last night, ma'am?" she asked, "downstairs in the passage?" "I thought I heard some voices whispering outside my room," Anne replied. "Has anything happened?" Extricated from the confusion in which she involved it, the girl's narrative amounted in substance to this. She had been startled by the sudden appearance of her mistress in the passage, staring about her wildly, like a woman who had gone out of her senses. Almost at the same moment the master had flung open the drawing-room door. He had caught Mrs. Dethridge by the arm, had dragged her into the room, and had closed the door again. After the two had remained shut up together for more than half an hour, Mrs. Dethridge had come out, as pale as ashes, and had gone upstairs trembling, like a person in great terror. Some time later, when the servant was in bed, but not asleep, she had seen a light under her door, in the narrow wooden passage which separated Anne's bedroom from Hester's bedroom, and by which she obtained access to her own little sleeping-chamber beyond. She had got out of bed, had looked through the keyhole, and had seen the master and Mrs. Dethridge standing together examining the walls of the passage. The master had laid his hand upon the wall, on the side of his wife's room, and had looked at Mrs. Dethridge. And Mrs. Dethridge had looked back at him, and had shaken her head. Upon that he had said in a whisper, still with his hand on the wooden wall, "Not to be done here?" And Mrs. Dethridge had shaken her head. He had considered a moment, and had whispered again, "The other room will do, won't it?" And Mrs. Dethridge had nodded her head, and so they had parted. That was the story of the night. Early in the morning more strange things had happened. The master had gone out, with a large sealed packet in his hand, covered with many stamps, taking his own letter to the post instead of sending the servant with it as usual. On his return, Mrs. Dethridge had gone out next, and had come back with something in a jar which she had locked up in her own sitting-room. Shortly afterward, a working-man had brought a bundle of laths, and some mortar and plaster of Paris, which had been carefully placed together in a corner of the scullery. Last, and most remarkable in the series of domestic events, the girl had received permission to go home and see her friends in the country on that very day, having been previously informed, when she entered Mrs. Dethridge's service, that she was not to expect to have a holiday granted to her until after Christmas. Such were the strange things which had happened in the house since the previous night. What was the interpretation to be placed on them? The right interpretation was not easy to discover. Some of the events pointed apparently toward coming repairs or alterations in the cottage. But what Geoffrey could have to do with them, being at the time served with a notice to quit, and why Hester Dethridge should have shown the violent agitation which had been described, were mysteries which it was impossible to penetrate. Anne dismissed the girl with a little present and a few kind words. Under other circumstances, the incomprehensible proceedings in the house might have made her seriously uneasy, but her mind was now occupied by more pressing anxieties. Blanche's second letter, received from Hester Dethridge on the previous evening, informed her that Sir Patrick persisted in his resolution, and that he and his niece might be expected, come what might of it, to present themselves at the cottage on that day. Anne opened the letter, and looked at it for the second time. The passages relating to Sir Patrick were expressed in these terms: "I don't think, darling, you have any idea of the interest that you have roused in my uncle. Although he has not to reproach himself, as I have, with being the miserable cause of the sacrifice that you have made, he is quite as wretched and quite as anxious about you as I am. We talk of nobody else. He said last night that he did not believe that there was your equal in the world. Think of that from a man who has such terribly sharp eyes for the faults of women in general, and such a terribly sharp tongue in talking of them. I am pledged to secrecy, but I must tell you one thing, between ourselves. Lord Holchester's announcement that his brother refuses to consent to a separation put my uncle almost beside himself. If there is not some change for the better in your life in a few days' time, Sir Patrick will find out a way of his own, lawful or not, he doesn't care, for rescuing you from the dreadful position in which you are placed, and Arnold, with my full approval, will help him. As we understand it, you are, under one pretence or another, kept a close prisoner. Sir Patrick has already secured a post of observation near you. He and Arnold went all round the cottage last night, and examined a door in your back garden wall, with a locksmith to help them. You will no doubt hear further about this from Sir Patrick himself. Pray don't appear to know anything of it when you see him. I am not in his confidence, but Arnold is, which comes to the same thing exactly. You will see us, I mean you will see my uncle and me, to-morrow, in spite of the brute who keeps you under lock and key. Arnold will not accompany us. He is not to be trusted, he owns it himself, to control his indignation. Courage, dearest. There are two people in the world to whom you are inestimably precious, and who are determined not to let your happiness be sacrificed. I am one of them, and, for heaven's sake, keep this a secret also, Sir Patrick is the other." Absorbed in the letter, and in the conflict of opposite feelings which it roused, her colour rising when it turned her thoughts inward on herself, and fading again when she was reminded by it of the coming visit, Anne was called back to a sense of present event by the reappearance of the servant, charged with a message. Mr. Speedwell had been for some time in the cottage, and he was now waiting to see her downstairs. Anne found the surgeon alone in the drawing-room. He apologized for disturbing her at that early hour. "It was impossible for me to get to Fulham yesterday," he said, "and I could only make sure of complying with Lord Holchester's request by coming here before the time at which I receive patients at home. I have seen Mr. Delamayn, and I have requested permission to say a word to you on the subject of his health." Anne looked through the window and saw Geoffrey smoking his pipe, not in the back garden as usual, but in front of the cottage, where he could keep his eye on the gate. "Is he ill?" she asked. "He is seriously ill," answered Mr. Speedwell. "I should not otherwise have troubled you with this interview. It is a matter of professional duty to warn you, as his wife, that he is in danger. He may be seized at any moment by a paralytic stroke. The only chance for him, a very poor one, I am bound to say, is to make him alter his present mode of life without loss of time." "In one way he will be obliged to alter it," said Anne. "He has received notice from the landlady to quit this cottage." Mr. Speedwell looked surprised. "I think you will find that the notice has been withdrawn," he said. "I can only assure you that Mr. Delamayn distinctly informed me, when I advised change of air, that he had decided, for reasons of his own, on remaining here." Another in the series of incomprehensible domestic events. Hester Dethridge, on all other occasions the most immovable of women, had changed her mind. "Setting that aside," proceeded the surgeon, "there are two preventive measures which I feel bound to suggest. Mr. Delamayn is evidently suffering, though he declines to admit it himself, from mental anxiety. If he is to have a chance for his life, that anxiety must be set at rest. Is it in your power to relieve it?"
It is not even in my power, Mr. Speedwell, to tell you what it is." The surgeon bowed, and went on. "The second caution that I have to give you," he said, "is to keep him from drinking spirits. He admits having committed an excess in that way the night before last. In his state of health, drinking means literally death. If he goes back to the brandy bottle, forgive me for saying it plainly, the matter is too serious to be trifled with. If he goes back to the brandy bottle, his life, in my opinion, is not worth 5 minutes' purchase. Can you keep him from drinking?" Anne answered sadly and plainly, "I have no influence over him. The terms we are living on here—" Mr. Speedwell considerately stopped her. "I understand," he said. "I will see his brother on my way home." He looked for a moment at Anne. "You are far from well yourself," he resumed. "Can I do anything for you?" "While I am living my present life, Mr. Speedwell, not even your skill can help me." The surgeon took his leave. Anne hurried back upstairs before Geoffrey could re-enter the cottage. To see the man who had laid her life waste, to meet the vindictive hatred that looked furtively at her out of his eyes, at the moment when sentence of death had been pronounced on him, was an ordeal from which every finer instinct in her nature shrank in horror. Hour by hour the morning wore on, and he made no attempt to communicate with her. Stranger still, Hester Dethridge never appeared. The servant came upstairs to say good-bye, and went away for her holiday. Shortly afterwards certain sounds reached Anne's ears from the opposite side of the passage. She heard the strokes of a hammer, and then a noise as of some heavy piece of furniture being moved. The mysterious repairs were apparently being begun in the spare room. She went to the window. The hour was approaching at which Sir Patrick and Blanche might be expected to make the attempt to see her. For the third time she looked at the letter. It suggested, on this occasion, a new consideration to her. Did the strong measures which Sir Patrick had taken in secret indicate alarm as well as sympathy? Did he believe she was in a position in which the protection of the law was powerless to reach her? It seemed just possible. Suppose she were free to consult a magistrate, and to own to him, if words could express it, the vague presentiment of danger which was then present in her mind, what proof could she produce to satisfy the mind of a stranger? The proofs were all in her husband's favour. Witnesses could testify to the conciliatory words which he had spoken to her in their presence. The evidence of his mother and brother would show that he had preferred to sacrifice his own pecuniary interests rather than consent to part with her. She could furnish nobody with the smallest excuse, in her case, for interfering between man and wife. Did Sir Patrick see this? And did Blanche's description of what he and Arnold Brinkworth were doing point to the conclusion that they were taking the law into their own hands in despair? The more she thought of it, the more likely it seemed. She was still pursuing the train of thought thus suggested when the gate-bell rang. The noises in the spare room suddenly stopped. Anne looked out. The roof of a carriage was visible on the other side of the wall. Sir Patrick and Blanche had arrived. After an interval Hester Dethridge appeared in the garden, and went to the grating in the gate. Anne heard Sir Patrick's voice, clear and resolute. Every word he said reached her ears through the open window. "Be so good as to give my card to Mr. Delamayn. Say that I bring him a message from Holchester House, and that I can only deliver it at a personal interview." Hester Dethridge returned to the cottage. Another and a longer interval elapsed. At the end of the time, Geoffrey himself appeared at the front gate, with the key in his hand. Anne's heart throbbed fast as she saw him unlock the gate, and asked herself what was to follow. To her unutterable astonishment, Geoffrey admitted Sir Patrick without the slightest hesitation, and, more still, he invited Blanche to leave the carriage and come in. "Let bygones be bygones," Anne heard him say to Sir Patrick. "I only want to do the right thing. If it is the right thing for visitors to come here, so soon after my father's death, come and welcome. My own notion was, when you proposed it before, that it was wrong. I am not much versed in these things. I leave it to you." "A visitor who brings you messages from your mother and your brother," Sir Patrick answered, gravely, "is a person whom it is your duty to admit, Mr. Delamayn, under any circumstances." "And he ought to be none the less welcome," added Blanche, "when he is accompanied by your wife's oldest and dearest friend." Geoffrey looked in stolid submission from one to the other. "I am not much versed in these things," he repeated. "I have said already, I leave it to you." They were by this time close under Anne's window. She showed herself. Sir Patrick took off his hat. Blanche kissed her hand with a cry of joy, and attempted to enter the cottage. Geoffrey stopped her, and called to his wife to come down. "No, no," said Blanche. "Let me go up to her in her room." She attempted for the second time to gain the stairs. For the second time Geoffrey stopped her. "Don't trouble yourself," he said. "She is coming down." Section 65 of Man and Wife. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynne Thompson. Man and Wife by Wilkie Collins. 16th Scene. Salt Patch. Chapter the 55th, Part 2. Anne joined them in the front garden. Blanche flew into her arms and devoured her with kisses. Sir Patrick took her hand in silence. For the first time in Anne's experience of him, the bright, resolute, self-reliant old man was, for the moment, at a loss what to say, at a loss what to do. His eyes, resting on her in mute sympathy and interest, said plainly, "In your husband's presence I must not trust myself to speak." Geoffrey broke the silence. "Will you go into the drawing-room?" he asked, looking with steady attention at his wife and Blanche. Geoffrey's voice appeared to rouse Sir Patrick. He raised his head. He looked like himself again. "Why go indoors this lovely weather?" he said. "Suppose we take a turn in the garden?" Blanche pressed Anne's hand significantly. The proposal was evidently made for a purpose. They turned the corner of the cottage and gained the large garden at the back, the two ladies walking together arm in arm, Sir Patrick and Geoffrey following them. Little by little Blanche quickened her pace. "I have got my instructions," she whispered to Anne. "Let's get out of his hearing." It was more easily said than done. Geoffrey kept close behind them. "Consider my lameness, Mr. Delamayn," said Sir Patrick. "Not quite so fast." It was well intended, but Geoffrey's cunning had taken the alarm. Instead of dropping behind with Sir Patrick, he called to his wife. "Consider Sir Patrick's lameness," he repeated. "Not quite so fast." Sir Patrick met that check with characteristic readiness. When Anne slackened her pace, he addressed himself to Geoffrey, stopping deliberately in the middle of the path. "Let me give you my message from Holchester House," he said. The two ladies were still slowly walking on. Geoffrey was placed between the alternatives of staying with Sir Patrick and leaving them by themselves, or following them and leaving Sir Patrick. Deliberately, on his side, he followed the ladies. Sir Patrick called him back. "I told you I wished to speak to you," he said sharply. Driven to bay, Geoffrey openly revealed his resolution to give Blanche no opportunity of speaking in private to Anne. He called to Anne to stop. "I have no secrets from my wife," he said, "and I expect my wife to have no secrets from me. Give me the message in her hearing." Sir Patrick's eyes brightened with indignation. He controlled himself, and looked for an instant significantly at his niece before he spoke to Geoffrey. "As you please," he said. "Your brother requests me to tell you that the duties of the new position in which he is placed occupy the whole of his time, and will prevent him from returning to Fulham, as he had proposed, for some days to come. Lady Holchester, hearing that I was likely to see you, has charged me with another message from herself. She is not well enough to leave home, and she wishes to see you at Holchester House to-morrow, accompanied, as she especially desires, by Mrs. Delamayn." In giving the two messages, he gradually raised his voice to a louder tone than usual. While he was speaking, Blanche, warned to follow her instructions by the glance her uncle had cast at her, lowered her voice, and said to Anne, "He won't consent to the separation as long as he has got you here. He is trying for higher terms. Leave him, and he must submit. Put a candle in your window if you can get into the garden to-night. If not, any other night. Make for the back gate in the wall. Sir Patrick and Arnold will manage the rest." She slipped those words into Anne's ears, swinging her parasol to and fro, and looking as if the merest gossip was dropping from her lips, with a dexterity which rarely fails a woman when she is called on to assist a deception in which her own interests are concerned. Cleverly as it had been done, however, Geoffrey's inveterate distrust was stirred into action by it. Blanche had got to her last sentence before he was able to turn his attention from what Sir Patrick was saying to what his niece was saying. A quicker man would have heard more. Geoffrey had only distinctly heard the first half of the last sentence. "What's that?" he asked. "About Sir Patrick and Arnold?" "Nothing very interesting to you," Blanche answered readily. "I will repeat it if you like. I was telling Anne about my stepmother, Lady Lundie. After what happened that day in Portland Place, she has requested Sir Patrick and Arnold to consider themselves for the future as total strangers to her. That's all." "Oh!" said Geoffrey, eyeing her narrowly. "Ask my uncle," returned Blanche, "if you don't believe that I have reported her correctly. She gave us all our dismissal in her most magnificent manner, and in those very words. Didn't she, Sir Patrick?" It was perfectly true. Blanche's readiness of resource had met the emergency of the moment by describing something, in connection with Sir Patrick and Arnold, which had really happened. Silenced on one side in spite of himself, Geoffrey was at the same moment pressed on the other for an answer to his mother's message. "I must take your reply to Lady Holchester," said Sir Patrick. "What is it to be?" Geoffrey looked hard at him, without making any reply. Sir Patrick repeated the message, with a special emphasis on that part of it which related to Anne. The emphasis roused Geoffrey's temper. "You and my mother have made that message up between you, to try me," he burst out. "Damn all underhand work, is what I say." "I am waiting for your answer," persisted Sir Patrick, steadily ignoring the words which had just been addressed to him. Geoffrey glanced at Anne, and suddenly recovered himself. "My love to my mother," he said. "I'll go to her to-morrow, and take my wife with me, with the greatest pleasure. Do you hear that? With the greatest pleasure." He stopped to observe the effect of his reply. Sir Patrick waited impenetrably to hear more, if he had more to say. "I'm sorry I lost my temper just now," he resumed. "I am badly treated. I'm distrusted without a cause. I ask you to bear witness," he added, his voice getting louder again, while his eyes moved uneasily backward and forward between Sir Patrick and Anne, "that I treat my wife as becomes a lady. Her friend calls on her, and she's free to receive her friend. My mother wants to see her, and I promise to take her to my mother's, at 2 o'clock to-morrow. Where am I to blame? You stand there looking at me, and saying nothing. Where am I to blame?" "If a man's own conscience justifies him, Mr. Delamayn," said Sir Patrick, "the opinions of others are of very little importance. My errand here is performed." As he turned to bid Anne farewell, the uneasiness that he felt at leaving her forced its way into view. The colour faded out of his face. His hand trembled as it closed tenderly and firmly on hers. "I shall see you to-morrow at Holchester House," he said, giving his arm, while he spoke, to Blanche. He took leave of Geoffrey without looking at him again, and without seeing his offered hand. In another minute they were gone. Anne waited on the lower floor of the cottage while Geoffrey closed and locked the gate. She had no wish to appear to avoid him, after the answer that he had sent to his mother's message. He returned slowly half way across the front garden, looked toward the passage in which she was standing, passed before the door, and disappeared round the corner of the cottage on his way to the back garden. The inference was not to be mistaken. It was Geoffrey who was avoiding her. Had he lied to Sir Patrick? When the next day came, would he find reasons of his own for refusing to take her to Holchester House? She went upstairs. At the same moment Hester Dethridge opened her bedroom door to come out. Observing Anne, she closed it again and remained invisible in her room. Once more the inference was not to be mistaken. Hester Dethridge also had her reasons for avoiding Anne. What did it mean? What object could there be in common between Hester and Geoffrey? There was no fathoming the meaning of it. Anne's thoughts reverted to the communication which had been secretly made to her by Blanche. It was not in womanhood to be insensible to such devotion as Sir Patrick's conduct implied. Terrible as her position had become, in its ever-growing uncertainty, in its never-ending suspense, the oppression of it yielded for the moment to the glow of pride and gratitude which warmed her heart as she thought of the sacrifices that had been made, of the perils that were still to be encountered solely for her sake. To shorten the period of suspense seemed to be a duty which she owed to Sir Patrick as well as to herself. Why, in her situation, wait for what the next day might bring forth? If the opportunity offered, she determined to put the signal in the window that night. Toward evening she heard once more the noises which appeared to indicate that repairs of some sort were going on in the house. This time the sounds were fainter, and they came, as she fancied, not from the spare room as before, but from Geoffrey's room next to it. The dinner was later than usual that day. Hester Dethridge did not appear with the tray till dusk. Anne spoke to her and received a mute sign in answer. Determined to see the woman's face plainly, she put a question which required a written answer on the slate, and, telling Hester to wait, went to the mantelpiece to light her candle. When she turned round, the lighted candle in her hand, Hester was gone. Night came. She rang her bell to have the tray taken away. The fall of a strange footstep startled her outside her door. She called out, "Who's there?" The voice of the lad whom Geoffrey employed to go on errands for him answered her. "What do you want here?" she asked through the door. "Mr. Delamayn sent me up, ma'am. He wishes to speak to you directly." Anne found Geoffrey in the dining-room. His object in wishing to speak to her was, on the surface of it, trivial enough. He wanted to know how she would prefer going to Holchester House on the next day, by the railway or in a carriage. "If you prefer driving," he said, "the boy has come here for orders, and he can tell them to send a carriage from the livery stables as he goes home." "The railway will do perfectly well for me," Anne replied. Instead of accepting the answer, and dropping the subject, he asked her to reconsider her decision. There was an absent, uneasy expression in his eye, as he begged her not to consult economy at the expense of her own comfort. He appeared to have some reason of his own for preventing her from leaving the room. "Sit down a minute and think before you decide," he said. Having forced her to take a chair, he put his head outside the door, and directed the lad to go upstairs and see if he had left his pipe in his bedroom. "I want you to go in comfort, as a lady should," he repeated, with the uneasy look more marked than ever. Before Anne could reply, the lad's voice reached them from the bedroom floor, raised in shrill alarm, and screaming, "Fire!" Geoffrey ran upstairs. Anne followed him. The lad met them at the top of the stairs. He pointed to the open door of Anne's room. She was absolutely certain of having left her lighted candle, when she went down to Geoffrey, at a safe distance from the bed-curtains. The bed-curtains, nevertheless, were in a blaze of fire. There was a supply of water to the cottage on the upper floor. The bedroom jugs and cans, usually in their places at an earlier hour, were standing that night at the cistern. An empty pail was left near them. Directing the lad to bring him water from these resources, Geoffrey tore down the curtains in a flaming heap, partly on the bed and partly on the sofa near it. Using the can and the pail alternately, as the boy brought them, he drenched the bed and the sofa, It was all over in a little more than a minute. The cottage was saved, but the bed furniture was destroyed, and the room, as a matter of course, was rendered uninhabitable, for that night at least, and probably for many more nights to come. Geoffrey set down the empty pail, and, turning to Anne, pointed across the passage. "You won't be much inconvenienced by this," he said. "You have only to shift your quarters to the spare room." With the assistance of the lad, he moved Anne's boxes and the chest of drawers, which had escaped damage, into the opposite room. This done, he cautioned her to be careful with her candles for the future, and went downstairs, without waiting to hear what she said in reply. The lad followed him, and was dismissed for the night. Even in the confusion which attended the extinguishing of the fire, the conduct of Hester Dethridge had been remarkable enough to force itself on the attention of Anne. She had come out from her bedroom when the alarm was given, had looked at the flaming curtains, and had drawn back, stolidly submissive, into a corner to wait the event. There she had stood, to all appearance utterly indifferent to the possible destruction of her own cottage. The fire extinguished, she still waited impenetrably in her corner, while the chest of drawers and the boxes were being moved, then locked the door, without even a passing glance at the scorched ceiling and the burned bed furniture, put the key into her pocket, and went back to her room. Anne had hitherto not shared the conviction felt by most other persons who were brought into contact with Hester Dethridge, that the woman's mind was deranged. After what she had just seen, however, the general impression became her impression too. She had thought of putting certain questions to Hester, when they were left together, as to the origin of the fire. Reflection decided her on saying nothing, for that night at least. She crossed the passage and entered the spare room, the room which she had declined to occupy on her arrival at the cottage, and which she was obliged to sleep in now. She was instantly struck by a change in the disposition of the furniture of the room. The bed had been moved. The head set, when she had last seen it, against the side wall of the cottage, was placed now against the partition wall which separated the room from Geoffrey's room. This new arrangement had evidently been effected with a settled purpose of some sort. The hook in the ceiling which supported the curtains, the bed, unlike the bed in the other room having no canopy attached to it, had been moved so as to adapt itself to the change that had been made. The chairs and the washstand, formerly placed against the partition wall, were now, as a matter of necessity, shifted over to the vacant space against the side wall of the cottage. For the rest, no other alteration was visible in any part of the room. In Anne's situation, any event not immediately intelligible on the face of it was an event to be distrusted. Was there a motive for the change in the position of the bed, and was it by any chance a motive in which she was concerned? The doubt had barely occurred to her before a startling suspicion succeeded it. Was there some secret purpose to be answered by making her sleep in the spare room? Did the question which the servant had heard Geoffrey put to Hester on the previous night refer to this? Had the fire which had so unaccountably caught the curtains in her own room been, by any possibility, a fire purposely kindled to force her out? She dropped into the nearest chair, faint with horror, as those three questions forced themselves in rapid succession on her mind. After waiting a little, she recovered self-possession enough to recognize the first plain necessity of putting her suspicions to the test. It was possible that her excited fancy had filled her with a purely visionary alarm. For all she knew to the contrary, there might be some undeniably sufficient reason for changing the position of the bed. She went out and knocked at the door of Hester Dethridge's room. "I want to speak to you," she said. Hester came out. Anne pointed to the spare room, and led the way to it. Hester followed her. "Why have you changed the place of the bed," she asked, "from the wall there to the wall here?" Stolidly submissive to the question, as she had been stolidly submissive to the fire, Hester Dethridge wrote her reply. On all other occasions she was accustomed to look the persons to whom she offered her slate steadily in the face. Now, for the first time, she handed it to Anne with her eyes on the floor. The one line written contained no direct answer. The words were these: "I have meant to move it for some time past. I ask you why you have moved it?" She wrote these 4 words on the slate: "The wall is damp." Anne looked at the wall. There was no sign of damp on the paper. She pressed her hand over it. Feel where she might, the wall was dry. "That is not your reason," she said. Hester stood immovable. "There is no dampness in the wall." Hester pointed persistently with her pencil to the 4 words, still without looking up, waited a moment for Anne to read them again, and left the room. It was plainly useless to call her back. Anne's first impulse when she was alone again was to secure the door. She not only locked it, but bolted it at top and bottom. The mortise of the lock and the staples of the bolts, when she tried them, were firm. The lurking treachery, wherever else it might be, was not in the fastenings of the door. She looked all round the room, examining the fireplace, the window and its shutters, the interior of the wardrobe, the hidden space under the bed. Nothing was anywhere to be discovered which could justify the most timid person living in feeling suspicion or alarm. Appearances, fair as they were, failed to convince her. The presentiment of some hidden treachery, steadily getting nearer and nearer to her in the dark, had rooted itself firmly in her mind. She sat down and tried to trace her way back to the clue through the earlier events of the day. The effort was fruitless. Nothing definite, nothing tangible, rewarded it. Worse still, a new doubt grew out of it, a doubt whether the motive which Sir Patrick had avowed through Blanche was the motive for helping her which was really in his mind. Did he sincerely believe Geoffrey's conduct to be animated by no worse object than a mercenary object? And was his only purpose in planning to remove her out of her husband's reach to force Geoffrey's consent to their separation on the terms which Julius had proposed? Was this really the sole end that he had in view, or was he secretly convinced, knowing Anne's position as he knew it, that she was in personal danger at the cottage, and had he considerately kept that conviction concealed, in the fear that he might otherwise encourage her to feel alarmed about herself? She looked round the strange room, in the silence of the night, and she felt that the latter interpretation was the likeliest interpretation of the 2. The sounds caused by the closing of the doors and windows reached her from the ground floor. What was to be done? It was impossible to show the signal which had been agreed on to Sir Patrick and Arnold. The window in which they expected to see it was the window of the room in which the fire had broken out, the room which Hester Dethridge had locked up for the night. It was equally hopeless to wait until the policeman passed on his beat and to call for help. Even if she could prevail upon herself to make that open acknowledgment of distrust under her husband's roof, and even if help was near, what valid reason could she give for raising an alarm? There was not the shadow of a reason to justify any one in placing her under the protection of the law. As a last resource, impelled by her blind distrust of the change in the position of the bed, she attempted to move it. The utmost exertion of her strength did not suffice to stir the heavy piece of furniture out of its place by so much as a hair's breadth. There was no alternative but to trust to the security of the locked and bolted door, and to keep watch through the night, certain that Sir Patrick and Arnold were, on their part, also keeping watch in the near neighbourhood of the cottage. She took out her work and her books, and returned to her chair, placing it near the table in the middle of the room. The last noises which told of life and movement about her died away. The breathless stillness of the night closed round her. End of Section 65.
Section 66 of Man and Wife. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Diana Schmidt. Man and Wife by Wilkie Collins. 16th Scene. Chapter the 56th. The Means. The new day dawned. The sun rose. The household was astir again. Inside the spare room and outside the spare room, nothing had happened. At the hour appointed for leaving the cottage to pay the promised visit to Holchester House, Hester Dethridge and Geoffrey were alone together in the bedroom in which Anne had passed the night. "She's dressed and waiting for me in the front garden," said Geoffrey. "You wanted to see me here alone? What is it?" Hester pointed to the bed. "You want it moved from the wall?" Hester nodded her head. They moved the bed some feet away from the partition wall. After a momentary pause, Geoffrey spoke again. "It must be done tonight," he said. "Her friends may interfere. The girl may come back. It must be done tonight." Hester bowed her head slowly. "How long do you want to be left by yourself in the house?" She held up 3 of her fingers. "Does that mean 3 hours?" She nodded her head. "Will it be done in that time?" She made the affirmative sign once more. Thus far she had never lifted her eyes to his. In her manner of listening to him when he spoke, in the slightest movement that she made when necessity required it, the same lifeless submission to him, the same mute horror of him, was expressed. He had, thus far, silently resented this on his side. On the point of leaving the room, the restraint which he had laid on himself gave way. For the first time, he resented it in words. "Why the devil can't you look at me?" he asked. She let the question pass, without a sign to show that she had heard him. He angrily repeated it. She wrote on her slate and held it out to him, still without raising her eyes to his face. "You know you can speak," he said. "You know I have found you out. What's the use of playing the fool with me?" She persisted in holding the slate before him. He read these words: "I am dumb to you and blind to you. Let me be." "Let you be," he repeated. "It's a little late in the day to be scrupulous after what you have done. Do you want your confession back or not?" As the reference to the confession passed his lips, she raised her head. A faint tinge of color showed itself on her livid cheeks. A momentary spasm of pain stirred her death-like face. The one last interest left in the woman's life was the interest of recovering the manuscript which had been taken from her. To that appeal the stunned intelligence still faintly answered, and to no other. "Remember the bargain on your side," Geoffrey went on, "and I'll remember the bargain on mine. This is how it stands, you know. I have read your confession, and I find one thing wanting. You don't tell how it was done. I know you smothered him, but I don't know how. I want to know. You're dumb, and you can't tell me. You must do to the wall here what you did in the other house. You run no risks. There isn't a soul to see you. You have got the place to yourself. When I come back, let me find this wall like the other wall. At that small hour of the morning, you know, when you were waiting, with the towel in your hand, for the first stroke of the clock. Let me find that, and tomorrow you shall have your confession back." As the reference to the confession passed his lips for the second time, the sinking energy in the woman leaped up in her once more. She snatched her slate from her side, and writing on it rapidly, held it with both hands close under his eyes. He read these words: "I won't wait. I must have it tonight." "Do you think I keep your confession about me?" said Geoffrey. "I haven't even got it in the house." She staggered back and looked up for the first time. "Don't alarm yourself," he went on. "It's sealed up with my seal, and it's safe in my banker's keeping. I posted it to them myself. You don't stick at a trifle, Mrs. Dethridge. If I had kept it locked up in the house, you might have forced the lock when my back was turned. If I had kept it about me, I might have had that towel over my face in the small hours of the morning. The bankers will give you back your confession just as they have received it from me, on receipt of an order in my handwriting. Do what I have told you, and you shall have the order tonight." She passed her apron over her face and drew a long breath of relief. Geoffrey turned to the door. "I will be back at 6 this evening," he said. "Shall I find it done?" She bowed her head. His first condition accepted, he proceeded to the second. When the opportunity offers, he resumed, I shall go up to my room. I shall ring the dining-room bell first. You will go up before me when you hear that, and you will show me how you did it in the empty house. She made the affirmative sign once more. At the same moment, the door in the passage below was opened and closed again. Geoffrey instantly went downstairs. It was possible that Anne might have forgotten something, and it was necessary to prevent her from returning to her own room. They met in the passage. Tired of waiting in the garden? He asked abruptly. She pointed to the dining-room. The postman has just given me a letter for you through the grating in the gate, she answered. I have to put it on the table in there. He went in. The handwriting on the address of the letter was the handwriting of Mrs. Glenarm. He put it unread into his pocket and went back to Anne. Step out, he said. We shall lose the train. They started for their visit to Holchester House. End of section 66.
Section 67 of Man and Wife. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Shihping Lynne. Man and Wife by Wilkie Collins. 16th Scene. Salt Patch. Chapter the 57th. The End. At a few minutes before 6 o'clock that evening, Lord Holchester's carriage brought Geoffrey and Anne back to the cottage. Geoffrey prevented the servant from ringing at the gate. He had taken the key with him when he left home earlier in the day. Having admitted Anne, and having closed the gate again, he went on before her to the kitchen window and called to Hester Dethridge. Take some cold water into the drawing-room, and fill the vase on the chimney-piece, he said. The sooner you put those flowers into water, he added, turning to his wife, the longer they will last. He pointed as he spoke to a nosegay in Anne's hand, which Julius had gathered for her from the conservatory at Holchester House. Leaving her to arrange the flowers in the vase, he went upstairs. After waiting for a moment, he was joined by Hester Dethridge. "Done?" he asked, in a whisper. Hester made the affirmative sign. Geoffrey took off his boots, and led the way into the spare room. They noiselessly moved the bed back to its place against the partition wall, and left the room again. When Anne entered it, some minutes afterward, not the slightest change of any kind was visible since she had last seen it in the middle of the day. She moved her bonnet and mantle, and sat down to rest. The whole course of events, since the previous night, had tended one way, and had exerted the same delusive influence over her mind. It was impossible for her any longer to resist the conviction that she had distrusted appearances without the slightest reason, and that she had permitted purely visionary suspicions to fill her with purely causeless alarm. In the firm belief that she was in danger, she had watched through the night, and nothing had happened. In the confident anticipation that Geoffrey had promised what he was resolved not to perform, she had waited to see what excuse he would find for keeping her at the cottage. And, when the time came for the visit, she found him ready to fulfill the engagement which he had made. At Holchester House, not the slightest interference had been attempted with her perfect liberty of action and speech. Resolved to inform Sir Patrick that she had changed her room, she had described the alarm of fire and the events which had succeeded it in the fullest detail, and had not been once checked by Geoffrey from beginning to end. She had spoken in confidence to Blanche, and had never been interrupted. Walking round the conservatory, she had dropped behind the others with perfect impunity to say a grateful word to Sir Patrick and to ask if the interpretation that he placed on Geoffrey's conduct was really the interpretation which had been hinted at by Blanche. They had talked together for 10 minutes or more. Sir Patrick had assured her that Blanche had correctly represented his opinion. He had declared his conviction that the rash way was, in her case, the right way, and that she would do well, with his assistance, to take the initiative in the matter of the separation, on herself. "As long as he can keep you under the same roof with him," Sir Patrick had said, "so long he will speculate on our anxiety to release you from the oppression of living with him, and so long he will hold out with his brother, in the character of a penitent husband, for higher terms. Put the signal in the window and try the experiment to-night. Once find your way to the garden door, and I answer for keeping you safely out of his reach until he has submitted to the separation and has signed the deed." In those words he had urged Anne to prompt action. He had received, in return, her promise to be guided by his advice. She had gone back to the drawing-room, and Geoffrey had made no remark on her absence. She had returned to Fulham, alone with him in his brother's carriage, and he had asked no questions. What was it natural, with her means of judging, to infer from all this? Could she see into Sir Patrick's mind, and detect that he was deliberately concealing his own conviction, in the fear that he might paralyze her energies if he acknowledged the alarm for her that he really felt? No, she could only accept the false appearances that surrounded her in the disguise of truth. She could only adopt, in good faith, Sir Patrick's assumed point of view, and believe, on the evidence of her own observation, that Sir Patrick was right. Toward dusk, Anne began to feel the exhaustion which was the necessary result of a night passed without sleep. She rang her bell, and asked for some tea. Hester Dethridge answered the bell. Instead of making the usual sign, she stood considering, and then wrote on her slate. These were the words: "I have all the work to do, now the girl has gone. If you would have your tea in the drawing-room, you would save me another journey upstairs." Anne at once engaged to comply with the request. "Are you ill?" she asked, noticing, faint as the light now was, something strangely altered in Hester's manner. Without looking up, Hester shook her head. "Has anything happened to vex you?" The negative sign was repeated. "Have I offended you?" She suddenly advanced a step, suddenly looked at Anne, checked herself with a dull moan like a moan of pain, and hurried out of the room. Concluding that she had inadvertently said or done something to offend Hester Dethridge, Anne determined to return to the subject at the first favorable opportunity. In the meantime, she descended to the ground floor. The dining-room door, standing wide open, showed her Geoffrey sitting at the table, writing a letter, with the fatal brandy bottle at his side. After what Mr. Speedwell had told her, it was her duty to interfere. She performed her duty without an instant's hesitation. "Pardon me for interrupting you," she said. "I think you have forgotten what Mr. Speedwell told you about that." She pointed to the bottle. Geoffrey looked at it, looked down again at his letter, and impatiently shook his head. She made a second attempt at remonstrance, again without effect. He only said, "All right," in lower tones than were customary with him, and continued his occupation. It was useless to court a third repulse, and went into the drawing-room. The letter on which he was engaged was an answer to Mrs. Glenarm, who had written to tell him that she was leaving town. He had reached his two concluding sentences when Anne spoke to him. They ran as follows: I may have news to bring you, before long, which you don't look for. Stay where you are through tomorrow, and wait to hear from me." After sealing the envelope, he emptied his glass of brandy and water, and waited, looking through the open door. When Hester Dethridge crossed the passage with the tea tray, and entered the drawing room, he gave the sign which had been agreed on. He rang his bell. Hester came out again, closing the drawing room door behind her. "Is she safe at her tea?" he asked, removing his heavy boots, and putting on the slippers which were placed ready for him. Hester bowed her head. He pointed up the stairs. "You go first," he whispered. "No nonsense, and no noise." She ascended the stairs. He followed slowly. Although he had only drunk one glass of brandy and water, his step was uncertain already. With one hand on the wall, and one hand on the banister, he made his way to the top, stopped, and listened for a moment, then joined Hester in his own room, and softly locked the door. "Well?" he said. She was standing motionless in the middle of the room, not like a living woman, like a machine waiting to be set in movement. Finding it useless to speak to her, he touched her, with a strange sensation of shrinking in him as he did it, and pointed to the partition wall. The touch roused her. With slow step and vacant face, moving as if she was walking in her sleep, she led the way to the papered wall, knelt down at the skirting board, and taking out two small sharp nails, lifted up a long strip of the paper which had been detached from the plaster beneath. Mounting on a chair, she turned back the strip and pinned it up, out of the way, using the two nails which she had kept ready in her hand. By the last dim rays of twilight, Geoffrey looked at the wall. A hollow space met his view. At a distance of some 3 feet from the floor, the laths had been sawn away, and the plaster had been ripped out, piecemeal, so as to leave a cavity, sufficient in height and width to allow free power of working in any direction to a man's arms. The cavity completely pierced the substance of the wall. Nothing but the paper on the other side prevented eye or hand from penetrating into the next room. Hester Dethridge got down from the chair and made signs for a light. Geoffrey took a match from the box. The same strange uncertainty which had already possessed his feet appeared now to possess his hands. He struck the match too heavily against the sandpaper, and broke it. He tried another, and struck it too lightly to kindle the flame. Hester took the box out of his hands. Having lit the candle, she held it low, and pointed to the skirting board. 2 little hooks were fixed into the floor, near the part of the wall from which the paper had been removed. 2 lengths of fine and strong string were twisted once or twice round the hooks. The loose ends of the string, extending to some length beyond the twisted parts, were neatly coiled away against the skirting board. The other ends, drawn tight, disappeared in 2 small holes drilled through the wall, at a height of a foot from the floor. After first untwisting the strings from the hooks, Hester rose, and held the candle so as to light the cavity in the wall. 2 more pieces of the fine string were seen here, resting loose upon the uneven surface which marked the lower boundary of the hollowed space. Lifting these higher strings, Hester lifted the loosened paper in the next room. The lower strings, which had previously held the strip firm and flat against the sound portion of the wall, working in their holes, and allowing the paper to move up freely. As it rose higher and higher, Geoffrey saw thin strips of cotton wool lightly attached, at intervals, to the back of the paper, so as effectually to prevent it from making a grating sound against the wall. Up and up it came slowly till it could be pulled through the hollow space, and pinned up out of the way as the strip previously lifted had been pinned before it. Hester drew back and made way for Geoffrey to look through. There was Anne's room, visible through the wall. He softly parted the light curtains that hang over the bed. There was the pillow on which her head would rest at night, within reach of his hands. The deadly dexterity of it struck him cold. His nerves gave way. He drew back with a start of guilty fear, and looked round the room. A pocket flask of brandy lay on the table at his bedside. He snatched it up and emptied it at a draught, and felt like himself again. He beckoned to Hester to approach him. "Before we go any further," he said, "there's one thing I want to know. How is it all to be put right again? Suppose this room is examined, those strings will show." Hester opened a cupboard and produced a jar. She took out the cork. There was a mixture inside which looked like glue. Partly by signs and partly by help of the slate, she showed how the mixture could be applied to the back of the loosened strip of paper in the next room, how the paper could be glued to the sound lower part of the wall by tightening the strings, how the strings, having served that purpose, could be safely removed, how the same process could be followed in Geoffrey's room after the hollowed place had been filled up again, with the materials waiting in the scullery, or even without filling up the hollowed place, if the time failed for doing it. In either case, the refastened paper would hide everything, and the wall would tell no tales. Geoffrey was satisfied. He pointed next to the towels in his room. "Take one of them," he said, "and show me how you did it with your own hands." As he said the words, Anne's voice reached his ear from below, calling for Mrs. Dethridge. It was impossible to say what might happen next. In another minute she might go up to her room and discover everything. Geoffrey pointed to the wall. "Put it right again," he said, "instantly." It was soon done. All that was necessary was to let the two strips of paper drop back into their places, to fasten the strip to the wall in Anne's room, by tightening the two lower strings, and then to replace the nails which held the loose strip on Geoffrey's side. In a minute the wall had resumed its customary aspect. They stole out, and looked over the stairs into the passage below. After calling uselessly for the second time, Anne appeared, crossed over to the kitchen, and returning again with the kettle in her hand, closed the drawing-room door. Hester Dethridge waited impenetrably to receive her next directions. There were no further directions to give. The hideous dramatic representation of the woman's crime for which Geoffrey had asked was in no respect necessary. The means were all prepared, and the manner of using them was self-evident. Nothing but the opportunity, and the resolution to profit by it, were wanting to lead the way to the end. Geoffrey signed to Hester to go downstairs. "Get back into the kitchen," he said, "before she comes out again. I shall keep in the garden. When she goes up into her room for the night, show yourself at the back door, and I shall know." Hester set her foot on the first stair, stopped, turned round, and looked slowly along the two walls of the passage, from end to end, shuddered, shook her head, and went slowly on, down the stairs. "What were you looking for?" he whispered after her. She neither answered nor looked back. She went her way into the kitchen. He waited a minute, and then followed her. On his way out to the garden he went into the dining room. The moon had risen. and the window shutters were not closed. It was easy to find the brandy and the jug of water on the table. He mixed the two, and emptied the tumbler at a draught. "My head's queer," he whispered to himself. He passed his handkerchief over his face. "How infernally hot it is to-night!" He made for the door. It was open, and plainly visible, and yet he failed to find his way to it. Twice he found himself trying to walk through the wall, on either side. The third time he got out, and reached the garden. A strange sensation possessed him as he walked round and round. He had not drunk enough, or nearly enough, to intoxicate him. His mind, in a dull way, felt the same as usual, but his body was like the body of a drunken man. The night advanced. The clock of Putney Church struck 10. Anne appeared again from the drawing-room with a bedroom candle in her hand. "Put out the lights," she said to Hester, at the kitchen door. "I'm going upstairs." She entered her room. The insupportable sense of weariness, after the sleepless night that she had passed, weighed more heavily on her than ever. She locked her door, but forbore on this occasion to fasten the bolts. The dread of danger was no longer present to her mind, and there was this positive objection to losing the bolts, that the unfastening of them would increase the difficulty of leaving the room noiselessly later in the night. She loosened her dress, and lifted her hair from her temples, and paced to and fro in the room wearily, thinking. Geoffrey's habits were irregular. Hester seldom went to bed early. 2 hours at least, more probably 3, must pass before it would be safe to communicate with Sir Patrick by means of the signal in the window. Her strength was fast failing her. If she persisted for the next 3 hours in denying herself the repose which she sorely needed, the chances were that her nerves might fail her through sheer exhaustion when the time came for facing the risk and making the effort to escape. Sleep was falling on her even now, and sleep she must have. She had no fear of failing to wake at the needful time. Falling asleep, with a special necessity for rising at a given hour present to her mind, Anne, like most other sensitively organized people, could trust herself to wake at that given hour instinctively. She put her lighted candle in a safe position, and lay down on the bed. In less than 5 minutes she was in a deep sleep. The church clock struck the 11:15. Hester Dethridge showed herself at the back garden door. Geoffrey crossed the lawn and joined her. The light of the lamp in the passage fell on his face. She started back from the sight of it. "What's wrong?" he asked. She shook her head, and pointed through the dining-room door to the brandy bottle on the table. "I am as sober as you are, you fool," he said. "Whatever else it is, it's not that." Hester looked at him again. He was right. However unsteady his gait might be, his speech was not the speech, his eyes were not the eyes, of a drunken man. "Is she in her room for the night?" Hester made the affirmative sign. Geoffrey ascended the stairs, swaying from side to side. He stopped at the top and beckoned to Hester to join him. He went on into his room, and signing to her to follow him, closed the door. He looked at the partition wall, without approaching it. Hester waited behind him. "Is she asleep?" he asked. Hester went to the wall, listened at it, and made the affirmative reply. He sat down. "My head's queer," he said. "Give me a drink of water." He drank part of the water, and poured the rest over his head. Hester turned toward the door to leave him. He instantly stopped her. "I can't unwind the strings. I can't lift up the paper. Do it." She sternly made the sign of refusal. She resolutely opened the door to leave him. "Do you want your confession back?" he asked. She closed the door, stolidly submissive, in an instant, and crossed to the partition wall. She lifted the loose strips of paper on either side of the wall, pointed through the hollowed place, and drew back again to the other end of the room. He rose and walked unsteadily from the chair to the foot of his bed, holding by the woodwork of the bed. He waited a little. While he waited, he became conscious of a change in the strange sensation that possessed him. A feeling as of a breath of cold air passed over the right side of his head. He became steady again. He could calculate his distances. He could put his hands through the hollowed place and draw aside the light curtains, hanging from the hook in the ceiling over the head of her bed. He could look at his sleeping wife. She was dimly visible by the light of the candle placed at the other end of her room. The worn and weary look had disappeared from her face. All that had been purest and sweetest in it in the bygone time seemed to be renewed by the deep sleep that held her gently. She was young again in the dim light. She was beautiful in her calm repose. Her head lay back on the pillow. Her upturned face was in a position which placed her completely at the mercy of the man under whose eyes she was sleeping, the man who was looking at her with the merciless resolution in him to take her life. After waiting a while, he drew back. "She's more like a child than a woman to-night," he muttered to himself under his breath. He glanced across the room at Hester Dethridge. The lighted candle which she had brought upstairs with her was burning near the place where she stood. "Blow it out," he whispered. She never moved. He repeated the direction. There she stood, deaf to him. What was she doing? She was looking fixedly into one of the corners of the room. He turned his head again toward the hollowed place in the wall. He looked at the peaceful face on the pillow once more. He deliberately revived his own vindictive sense of the debt that he owed her. "But for you," he whispered to himself, "I should have won the race. But for you, I should have been friends with my father. But for you, I might marry Mrs. Glenarm." He turned back again into the room while the sense of it was at its fiercest in him. He looked round and round him. He took up a towel, considered for a moment, and threw it down again. A new idea struck him. In 2 steps he was at the side of his bed. He seized on one of the pillows, and looked suddenly at Hester. "It's not a drunken brute this time," he said to her. "It's a woman who will fight for her life. The pillow's the safest of the two." She never answered him, and never looked toward him. He made once more for the place in the wall, and stopped midway between it and his bed. Stopped, and cast a backward glance over his shoulder. Hester Dethridge was stirring at last. With no third person in the room, she was looking and moving, nevertheless, as if she was following a third person along the wall from the corner. Her lips were parted in horror. Her eyes, opening wider and wider, stared rigid and glittering at the empty wall. Step by step she stole nearer and nearer to Geoffrey, still following some visionary thing which was stealing nearer and nearer too. He asked himself what it meant. Was the terror of the deed that he was about to do more than the woman's brain could bear? Would she burst out screaming, and wake his wife? He hurried to the place in the wall, to seize the chance, while the chance was his. He steadied his strong hold on the pillow. He stooped to pass it through the opening. He poised it over Anne's sleeping face. At the same moment he felt Hester Dethridge's hand laid on him from behind. The touch ran through him from head to foot like a touch of ice. He drew back with a start, and faced her. Her eyes were staring straight over his shoulder at something behind him, looking as they had looked in the garden at Windygates. Before he could speak, he felt the flash of her eyes in his eyes. For the third time she had seen the apparition behind him. The homicidal frenzy possessed her. She flew at his throat like a wild beast. The feeble old woman attacked the athlete. He dropped the pillow and lifted his terrible right arm to brush her from him, as he might have brushed an insect from him. Even as he raised the arm, a frightful distortion seized on his face. As if with an invisible hand, it dragged down the brow and the eyelid on the right. It dragged down the mouth on the same side. His arm fell helpless. His whole body, on the side under the arm, gave way. He dropped on the floor like a man shot dead. Hester Dethridge pounced on his prostrate body, knelt on his broad breast, and fastened her 10 fingers on his throat. The shock of the fall woke Anne on the instant. She started up, looked round, and saw a gap in the wall at the head of her bed, and a candle light glimmering in the next room. Panic-stricken, doubting, for the moment, if she were in her right mind, she drew back, waiting, listening, looking. She saw nothing but the glimmering light in the room. She heard nothing but a hoarse gasping, as of some person laboring for breath. The sound ceased. There was an interval of silence. Then the head of Hester Dethridge rose slowly into sight through the gap in the wall, rose with the glittering light of madness in the eyes, and looked at her. She flew to the open window and screamed for help. Sir Patrick's voice answered her, from the road in front of the cottage. "Wait for me, for God's sake!" she cried. She fled from the room, and rushed down the stairs. In another moment she had opened the door, and was out in the front garden. As she ran to the gate, she heard the voice of a strange man on the other side of it. Sir Patrick called to her encouragingly. "The policeman is with us," he said. "He patrols the garden at night. He has a key." As he spoke, the gate was opened from the outside. She saw Sir Patrick, Arnold, and the policeman. She staggered toward them as they came in. She was just able to say, "Upstairs," before her senses failed her. Sir Patrick saved her from falling. He placed her on the bench in the garden, and waited by her, while Arnold and the policeman hurried into the cottage. "Where first?" asked Arnold. "The room the lady called from," said the policeman. They mounted the stairs, and entered Anne's room. The gap in the wall was instantly observed by both of them. They looked through it. Geoffrey Delamayn's dead body lay on the floor. Hester Dethridge was kneeling at his head, praying. End of section 67. Recording by shihping Lynne.
Section 68 of Man and Wife. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynne Thompson. Man and Wife by Wilkie Collins. Epilogue. A Morning Call. 1. The newspapers have announced the return of Lord and Lady Holchester to their residence in London after an absence on the Continent of more than 6 months. It is the height of the season. All day long, within the canonical hours, the door of the Holchester house is perpetually opening to receive visitors. The vast majority leave their cards, and go away again. Certain privileged individuals only get out of their carriages and enter the house. Among these last, arriving at an earlier hour than is customary, is a person of distinction, who is positively bent on seeing either the master or the mistress of the house, and who will take no denial. While this person is parleying with the chief of the servants, Lord Holchester, passing from one room to another, happens to cross the inner end of the hall. The person instantly darts at him with a cry of "Dear Lord Holchester!" Julius turns, and sees Lady Lundie. He is fairly caught, and he gives way with his best grace. As he opens the door of the nearest room for her ladyship, he furtively consults his watch, and says in his inmost soul, "How am I to get rid of her before the others come?" Lady Lundie settles down on a sofa, in a whirlwind of silk and lace, and becomes, in her own majestic way, perfectly charming. She makes the most affectionate inquiries about Lady Holchester, about the Dowager Lady Holchester, about Julius himself. Where have they been? What have they seen? Have time and change helped them to recover the shock of that dreadful event, to which Lady Lundie dare not more particularly allude? Julius answers resignedly, and a little absently. He makes polite inquiries on his side as to her ladyship's plans and proceedings, with a mind uneasily conscious of the inexorable lapse of time, and of certain probabilities which that lapse may bring with it. Lady Lundie has very little to say about herself. She is only in town for a few weeks. Her life is a life of retirement. My modest round of duties at Windygates, Lord Holchester, occasionally relieved, when my mind is overworked, by the society of a few earnest friends whose views harmonize with my own, my existence passes, not quite uselessly, I hope, in that way. I have no news. I see nothing, except indeed yesterday a sight of the saddest kind. She pauses there. Julius observes that he is expected to make inquiries, and makes them accordingly. Lady Lundie hesitates, announces that her news refers to that painful past event which she has already touched on, acknowledges that she could not find herself in London without feeling an act of duty involved in making inquiries at the asylum in which Hester Dethridge is confined for life, announces that she has not only made the inquiries, but has seen the unhappy woman herself, has spoken to her, has found her unconscious of her dreadful position, incapable of the smallest exertion of memory, resigned to the existence that she leads, and likely, in the opinion of the medical superintendent, to live for some years to come. Having stated these facts, her ladyship is about to make a few of those remarks appropriate to the occasion, in which she excels, when the door opens, and Lady Holchester, in search of her missing husband, enters the room. 2. There is a new outburst of affectionate interest on Lady Lundie's part, met civilly, but not cordially, by Lady Holchester. Julius's wife seems, like Julius, to be uneasily conscious of the lapse of time. Like Julius again, she privately wonders how long Lady Lundie is going to stay. Lady Lundie shows no signs of leaving the sofa. She has evidently come to Holchester House to say something, and she has not said it yet. Is she going to say it? Yes, she is going to get, by a roundabout way, to the object in view. She has another inquiry of the affectionate sort to make. May she be permitted to resume the subject of Lord and Lady Holchester's travels? They have been at Rome. Can they confirm the shocking intelligence which has reached her of the apostasy of Mrs. Glenarm? Lady Holchester can confirm it by personal experience. Mrs. Glenarm has renounced the world, and has taken refuge in the bosom of the Holy Catholic Church. Lady Holchester has seen her in a convent at Rome. She is passing through the period of her probation, and she is resolved to take the veil. Lady Lundie, as a good Protestant, lifts her hands in horror, declares the topic to be too painful to dwell on, and, by way of varying it, goes straight to the point at last. Has Lady Holchester, in the course of her continental experience, happened to meet with, or to hear of, Mrs. Arnold Brinkworth? I have ceased, as you know, to hold any communication with my relatives, Lady Lundie explains. The course they took at the time of our family trial, the sympathy they felt with a person whom I cannot even now trust myself to name more particularly, alienated us from each other. I may be grieved, dear Lady Holchester, but I bear no malice, and I shall always feel a motherly interest in hearing of Blanche's welfare. I have been told that she and her husband were travelling, at the time when you and Lord Holchester were travelling. Did you meet with them?" Julius and his wife looked at each other. Lord Holchester is dumb. Lady Holchester replies: "We saw Mr. and Mrs. Arnold Brinkworth at Florence, and afterwards at Naples, Lady Lundie. They returned to England a week since, in anticipation of a certain happy event, which will possibly increase the members of your family circle. They are now in London. Indeed, I may tell you that we expect them here to lunch to-day." Having made this plain statement, Lady Holchester looks at Lady Lundie. If that doesn't hasten her departure, nothing will. Quite useless. Lady Lundie holds her ground. Having heard absolutely nothing of her relatives for the last 6 months, she is burning with curiosity to hear more. There is a name she has not mentioned yet. She places a certain constraint upon herself, and mentions it now. "And Sir Patrick?" says her ladyship, subsiding into a gentle melancholy, suggestive of past injuries condoned by Christian forgiveness. "I only know what report tells me. Did you meet with Sir Patrick at Florence and Naples also?" Julius and his wife look at each other again. The clock in the hall strikes. Julius shudders. Lady Holchester's patience begins to give way. There is an awkward pause. Somebody must say something. As before, Lady Holchester replies: "Sir Patrick went abroad, Lady Lundie, with his niece and her husband, and Sir Patrick has come back with them." "In good health?" her ladyship inquires. "Younger than ever," Lady Holchester rejoins. Lady Lundie smiles satirically. Lady Holchester notices the smile, decides that mercy shown to this woman is mercy misplaced, and announces, to her husband's horror, that she has news to tell of Sir Patrick which will probably take his sister-in-law by surprise. Lady Lundie awaits eagerly to hear what the news is. "It is no secret," Lady Holchester proceeds, "though it is only known as yet to a few intimate friends. Sir Patrick has made an important change in his life." Lady Lundie's charming smile suddenly dies out. "Sir Patrick is not only a very clever and a very agreeable man," Lady Holchester resumes a little maliciously, "he is also, in all his habits and ways, as you well know, a man younger than his years, who still possesses many of the qualities which seldom fail to attract women." Lady Lundie starts to her feet. "You don't mean to tell me, Lady Holchester, that Sir Patrick is married?" "I do." Her ladyship drops back on the sofa, helpless, really and truly helpless, under the double blow that has fallen on her. She is not only struck out of her place as the chief woman of the family, but, still on the right side of 40, she is socially superannuated, as the Dowager Lady Lundie, for the rest of her life. "At his age!" she exclaims as soon as she can speak. "Pardon me for reminding you," Lady Holchester answers, "that plenty of men marry at Sir Patrick's age. In his case, it is only due to him to say, that his motive raises him beyond the reach of ridicule or reproach. His marriage is a good action in the highest sense of the word. It does honour to him, as well as to the lady who shares his position and his name." "A young girl, of course," is Lady Lundie's next remark. "No, a woman who has been tried by no common suffering, and who has borne her hard lot nobly. A woman who deserves the calmer and the happier life on which she is entering now." "May I ask who she is?" Before the question can be answered, a knock at the house door announces the arrival of visitors. For the third time, Julius and his wife look at each other. On this occasion, Julius interferes. My wife has already told you, Lady Lundie, that we expect Mr. and Mrs. Brinkworth to lunch. Sir Patrick and the new Lady Lundie accompany them. If I am mistaken in supposing that it might not be quite agreeable to you to meet them, I can only ask your pardon. If I am right, I will leave Lady Holchester to receive our friends, and will do myself the honour of taking you into another room." He advances to the door of an inner room. He offers his arm to Lady Lundie. Her ladyship stands immovable, determined to see the woman who has supplanted her. In a moment more, the door of entrance from the hall is thrown open, and the servant announces, "Sir Patrick and Lady Lundie, Mr. and Mrs. Arnold Brinkworth." Lady Lundie looks at the woman who has taken her place at the head of the family, and sees Anne Silvester. End of Section 68. End of Man and Wife, by Wilkie Collins.